Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to Islamic at Authors with myself, al-Azami. And it gives me immense pleasure to welcome this week Dr. Rushain Abbasi from Yale University, soon to be from Stanford University, who who's recently graduated from Harvard and with a PhD in Near Eastern languages and cultures, and has a fascinating project on Islam and the secular. I'm saying this from memory, but your dissertation which is a massive piece of work, and we'll talk about this in a moment, inshallah, is called Beyond the Realm of Religion, Islam and the Idea of the Secular. And really an impressive and a tour de force, which is a very important intervention in the field of Islamic studies and the question of secularism. And you've also published a couple of articles, one on the Deen Dunya distinction, and the other on basically the notion of religion in the Islamic tradition as a sort of, it's kind of a long history of the concept of tradition. I've had the good fortune to read both those articles. Because this is kind of the exam week and marking week, the past 2 weeks have been a bit sort of hectic. I've only read through half of your enormous dissertation. And so I look forward to sort of hearing your broad overview of this topic. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners will be looking forward to that as well, inshallah. But this is, as per usual, people are welcome to put in their comments. You can type in your comments on Facebook and YouTube in particular, and in the chat, and then we'll be able to read them, inshallah. So the usual format, as I've mentioned to you, Rushain, is that you'll, inshallah, introduce your. I guess this is a project. It's more than just a single book, and it's actually the dissertation hasn't been published. So I feel very fortunate that you've given me an insider's view, so to speak. For anyone else who wants to read it, you'll have to go and visit Harvard. And in addition to that, you'll be talking about, you can introduce your project more broadly. Thereafter, we'll launch into a conversation, inshallah. And I'm grateful you've said that you're happy to go on for as long as sort of we have the opportunity to. And I would, after about half an hour of that discussion, I would begin to welcome people to ask their questions. You can ask them in advance, and if Rushain is interested in taking them midstream, you're welcome to exercise that prerogative as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome you to, inshallah, introduce your project, so to speak.
Sure, thank you so much, Bismillah. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak about my work, especially at this relatively early stage in the project. Which leads me to my first disclaimer. It is a work in progress, so to speak. I mean, the dissertation is in its complete form, and much of my argument will remain by the time it's revised into a book. There's a lot of going back and trying to reflect on the implications of my findings. Uh, but I do have two articles, as you mentioned, which are very related to this broader project of Islam and the idea of the secular. The first is an article I published last year on the Deen Dunya distinction, which was essentially a graduate paper I wrote in my first year, actually while I was at Princeton, and it was in Michael Cook's famous seminar
Right.
on the scholarly sources, where essentially he, by the end of the course, asks you to dig a very deep well in one particular topic. And for me, and this relates to the broader project and what sparked my interest, as someone who began his academic career very interested in these theoretical interventions in religious studies and secularism and more broadly in political theology and related fields. I very much admired these sorts of interventions for provincializing European supposedly universal norms and categorizations. But one curious fact always I always felt uneasy about, which was that it was a very exceedingly Eurocentric affair. And what I mean by that is when we look at the most influential works in the past couple of decades. And this has been a growing trend, essentially a cottage industry around the invention of religion, the invention of the state, secularism, of course, and so many other supposedly modern phenomenon categories. The Either it's a kind of anthropological, ethnographic study of modern secularism, or historical analysis of the rise of the modern state, and that's all. I took all of that very well, and it's very interesting to me, and I incorporate much of that into my dissertation. But as I mentioned earlier, they don't go further back than perhaps the 18th century, and particularly in Europe, and that always unsettled me quite a bit. And so I began from the early stage in my PhD wondering about, well, what was the possibility of these sorts of categories, and also these sorts of phenomena in the past, and particularly in the Islamic context, since that's my specialization. Um, and so with the Deen Dunya paper, which was the kind of initial foray into this subject, and I've kind of, it's a preliminary synopsis of much of what I do in the dissertation, but in the dissertation I go much further than I did in the article. And essentially, what I did in that first article, and then that led me to my second article as well, on the category of religion itself, Deen, and which was published this just a couple of months ago, and was actually the first chapter of my dissertation initially, but I very early on decided to separate it as a kind of standalone article, and focus primarily on the secular during my dissertation. And so what I did in these two articles is to look at how these very if we're looking for some type of idea of religion or some kind of understanding of the worldly or the secular, we have these very prominent categories which stand out in the Islamic tradition, namely Deen and Dunya.
Right.
And essentially what I uncovered is that there's, as a modern person reading the discussions around these sorts of concepts, from the 10th to the 15th century, one is able to kind of relate very closely to the way in which these scholars and thinkers are discussing these concepts. So, to give one very concrete example for the category of religion, the first text that initially sparked this idea for me was a text by the 10th century Persian philosopher al-Hasan al-Amiri, who has this text, al-I'lam bi manaqib al-Islam, the Declaration of the Virtues of Islam, which is essentially a polemical text to prove why Islam is greater than the other world religions.
Right.
And in a plain reading of the text, one very quickly discerns that there's quite a bit of sophisticated analysis, not only in terms of comparative religion, but of the idea of religion itself. What does a religion mean? How does it function in a society? What does religion consist of? Essentially, it's similar questions as we might ask in a religious studies classroom today. Well, what is religion itself? Now, the answers might be quite different from what we might come up with today, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they're engaging in similar kinds of discussions. So, what that sparked for me in the dissertation was this increasing compulsion to just dive deep into the Islamic tradition to find out and discover how Muslims employ these kinds of categories and discuss them. And mine isn't really a history of terms itself. It's not simply about looking at the development of a word, but to look at the broader context in which these sorts of forms of differentiation emerge. And the primary form of differentiation I'm interested in looking at is the differentiation between religion and non-religion. And for me, there are quite a few kind of native conceptualizations which map onto these categories. There's Deen and Dunya, of course. There's also something like reason and revelation, the aqli and the shara'i. Sometimes some authors like Ghazali will employ the term shara'i and ghayr shara'i. Also, the very sophisticated discussions of the relationship between falasifa, meaning not only philosophy as we understand today, but in some sense science.
The ancient Greek tradition.
Exactly, the ancient Greek tradition, which incorporated the natural sciences, physics, as well as metaphysics as well, in relation to the ulum al-shar'iyya. So what I do in the dissertation, and I'll focus on the dissertation right now, is I I systematically probe specific themes within the Islamic tradition, with an eye towards the implications of their discussions of these concepts for our contemporary understanding of secularism. And
Right.
to speak to the latter point, which will clarify the kind of intervention I'm making, I propose in the introduction, which you've read, um, I mean, I'm still working out the names, but
Right.
what I've called it for now is this kind of Islam secularism incommensurability paradigm that has, I think, dominated our discussions about Islam and secularism today. And
Right.
here are the kind of famous works of Talal Asad and his school, his students, Saba Mahmoud, Hussein Al-Grama, and
Right.
even more recent scholars, young graduates who are writing in this similar sort of genealogical intervention.
Right.
Um, and what they've sort of popularized, in my view, is um, a stark binary between a kind of secular mode of and ways of being and knowing with Islamic ways of being and knowing, and and I think they have made very valuable contributions in their ability to interrogate the uh, supposed universality of secularism, that it purports to kind of be a neutral overcoming of religion, and showing the kind of somewhat violent underpinnings epistemically, but also physically, of the ideology of secularism across the globe. But as I hinted towards earlier in speaking about the category of religion, again, it's a highly Eurocentric affair. I quote one reviewer of Assad's, I think his genealogies perhaps, who says, you know, Assad does a wonderful job of undermining this Western secular supremacy or hegemony. And I think that's precisely what they're doing, is they're undermining this hegemonic discourse. And it opens up the way for the kind of intervention I'm making. But for me, there's a massive gap. And there's also a danger because um, uh, what I find is that in their intervention, although it's, I believe, much more sophisticated than a lot of Islamist or Orientalist discourse about the radical divergence between Islam and the modern Western secular, I think it, in some ways, um, reinstitutes these kinds of binaries. And in this particular case, Islam becomes the kind of pious other of secularism. And my problem with that is that Islam is simply a polemical tool by which to undermine the modern West. And again, the particular, that particular end, or even that particular methodology, is not uh, illegitimate in and of itself. I think one can interrogate the modern West through, you know, classical Buddhism or whatever kind of ancient traditions, you know, as someone like McIntyre does with or Neo-Aristotelianism. But
Right.
what the problem here is that, unlike McIntyre, who has a great command of the Aristotelian tradition, and Aquinas, and essentially is trying to rehabilitate this history on its own terms, and similar historians who might have worked in that kind of vein, for Asad and a lot of these inheritors of his tradition, um, there is no deep engagement with the Islamic tradition. And what I discovered in over the course of my research for the past 3 to 4 years, essentially, is that there is a very clear space for comparativism between a certain kind of comparative analysis between how Muslims discussed the uh, differentiation between religion and non-religion, and how the modern Western secular has arranged that distinction. And for me, this sort of work allows us not only to uh, rehabilitate the Islamic tradition on its own terms, and to allow it to speak to our contemporary problems in political theory and religious studies, but it also, I think, helps us understand more precisely what is distinctive about the modern. Because, and this is, for example, related to my religion article, the central argument I'm making is that, well, the reification of religion, the idea of religion as something sort of disembedded from the world, and as kind of standalone category which is separated from other realms of life, is something which has been very popularly argued to be a uniquely modern invention. And I emphasize the word unique here because unique, um, it lends a kind of strong sense of sole provenance to modern Europe alone. And of course, the idea of invention is very similar as well, that nothing like it has come before. And to me, that is an utter over exaggeration if one looks very broadly in the classical Islamic tradition from, all along the ideological spectrum, from the Ithna Ashariya to the Sunni schools to the Sufis to whomever. What one finds is that, well, historically speaking, the reification of religion, the idea that religion is an idea in and of itself and can sort of be analyzed as a conceptual category in sociological terms, in um, kind of straightforward theological terms, and not simply as a normative category.
Hmm.
It's not simply something which came about in the 17th or 18th century, but actually had a much longer history in the
Right.
ancient Near East. And that what we find in the Islamic case is that here you have the first tradition, which is essentially born in this world in which these distinct religions are present and they are talking about one another, and they have developed essentially a category or different concepts which they use for religion. In the Zoroastrian tradition, that's Dana. In Islam, it's Deen, which is already used in the Quran. And Wilfred Cantwell Smith famously pointed out that Islam is the Quran is the first scripture that actually names or gives a designation to its people, or at least to the religion itself, which is Islam. Obviously, in the Bible, you don't have this term like Christianity, and obviously, there's this very robust debate about whether Judaism is a valid category until the modern period for the
Hmm.
Jewish people, Judaism qua religion.
Right.
And so, to go back to my initial point, when we look in the Islamic tradition, what we find is that, well, Muslims had a very similar sorts of discussion about, well, what does religion consist in? How does one go about comparison between religions? Um, what type of, or how should one understand the um, workings of religion within society, within political society? These were questions which they were fundamentally concerned with as, new rulers in a very multi cultural, religiously pluralistic region, of how to manage different religions, how to um, sort of win over the favor of people. And here the relevant concept of civic religion is very much present in, or civil religion, sorry,
Hmm.
is very much present in the Islamic tradition of
Right.
how to understand religion as this immensely important category by which people become bonded to one another to work alongside one another and essentially create a sustainable and robust polis. A question, again, which I think many ancient thinkers might have ruminated over. So these are the kinds of questions I'm exploring broadly within these distinct endeavors, but again, they're all very much related.
Right.
Um, and in the dissertation, and I'll just quickly end with this, in the
Sure.
dissertation, what I do is um, I try to probe the quote unquote Islamic secular through a kind of thematic approach. So we can go into obviously much more detail about the specific arguments I'm making,
Right.
but for me, what I've done is, I'll spend one chapter looking at the issue of prophethood, and another looking at the issue of politics, and another the subject of the law. And in each of them, I'll try to kind of mine the Islamic tradition for interesting sorts of conceptual distinctions in which religion and non-religion make themselves very much make themselves clear, but also come to the fore in very, very important debates in the Islamic tradition.
Right.
So, for example, and here the prophetic locus classicus is this famous hadith which many Muslims are familiar with,
Yeah.
in which the Prophet makes,
So,
gives this piece of advice about cross pollination of the trees in Medina, and essentially it doesn't work out so well for the Medinan farmers, and they ask him, well, what was that about? And essentially he clarifies himself and says, well, you know better your worldly affairs. Antum a'lam bi amri dunyakum. It's a very prominent hadith in the tradition. It's in many of the Sahih. It's present throughout the Sahih canon.
Sure.
And what I discovered is that it's not only a kind of a fringe hadith, which is mentioned in maybe some hadith collections. It actually became the kind of paradigmatic hadith around which this conception of the secular became elaborated in the Islamic tradition. In many different discussions relating to law, whether, for example, juristic consensus, this very important doctrine of ijma, does it apply to the umur deen, or the alone, which is to say, religious affairs, or does it also apply to the umur dunya? For example, how to develop the urban and rural settings in the cities, how to, for example, strategize warfare tactics and things like that. These are examples these jurists actually gave, and they would often refer to this hadith when they'd say, well, for example, juristic consensus does not apply to umur dunya, that this is something of a political decision that should be made. In other realms, when discussing, for example, the relationship between siyasa and sharia, the most renowned thinkers from Ghazali to Ibn Taymiyyah would essentially rely on this hadith, and also a few other instances from the Sira, the prophetic biography literature. Again, well-known incidents in which the Prophet is consulted for, prior to making a decision, or he's about to make a decision and he consults his followers. And they'll ask him, well, is this something of revelation, or is this your own opinion? And he would mention that this is his ra'i. And that's also one of these terms which is often invoked in these discussions. And they'd say, well, we'll obviously differ with you on this specific matter because it's not within your realm of authority as a prophet, per se. So, as you mentioned, it's, a very long dissertation. And the reason for that is that as time went by, there was just more and more to discover. And there are decisions I've still, I had to make of, just kind of putting aside a specific discussion because it would just keep, making me go down this rabbit hole. So what I found then is not simply that we can sort of discern some forms of secularity, which is to say this differentiation between religion and non-religion in the Islamic tradition. What I think is that you find that this sort of mode of differentiation is very much at the fore of scholarly reflection on politics, on prophethood, on epistemology. And what I'll end with is some of the more constructive findings and the more positivistic kind of arguments I'm making about the historically Islamic secular in the pre-modern period. And this is something I'm kind of working through now as I go back and move into this more comparativist mode of how the Islamic secular diverges from modern secularity. Well, one thing, and this is my kind of defense for why I often am okay translating the Dunyawi as secular, which is the first question that's often asked. So to kind of clarify terminologically, oftentimes in the tradition you find one binary is between the Dunyawi and the Ukhrawi. It's not, it's fairly prominent, but and it's essentially, I guess it's something like 50-50 with the Deen Dunya binary. Now, when it comes to the Dunyawi and the Ukhrawi, here there is a sort of kind of theological valence attached to this kind of differentiation. So my kind of comfortable translation for this distinction is between the worldly and the otherworldly. And one, you kind of pick this up from the Quran, وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. The idea that the other world, the hereafter is better than this world. One can already discern that there's this kind of normative theological value attached to this sort of distinction. And that's why here I call it, the worldly and otherworldly distinction. But what I found is that the Deen Dunya binary, and particularly the adjectival use of this term, the Dunyawi and the Dunyawi, the Dini and the Dunyawi or the Dunyawi, is always is fundamentally detached from this kind of normative theological valence, and is simply used to kind of differentiate between two distinct ontological or epistemological realms. And what's striking about this for me, and this comes back to the point of how it diverges from the modern secular. The first thing that must be said is the modern secular is essentially the Christian secular, because secularism is, and we'll come into we'll speak about this later, is
Sure.
essentially a kind of the latest point in a long theological debate regarding theodicy in the Christian tradition, regarding the relationship between religion and the world, and the kind of earthly city and the heavenly city. And much of political theological literature from Carl Schmitt forward has discussed this at length. And for me, one of the fundamental elements of the secular, going back to the saeculum and Augustine, and even earlier with Latin writers like Tertullian and others, is that the secular is always put into a negative relationship with the religious. By which I mean the fundamental kind of theoretical anti-worldliness which informs Christianity. And I have a whole chapter about this. And it's very clear by the kind of, these Pauline verses in the New Testament about, railing against the flesh. And one juxtaposes this very clearly with the kind of valorization of sexuality in some instances, very clearly in the prophetic hadith and in the early Islamic tradition. It seems a kind of inverse of much of the Christian understanding of the relationship between the heavenly and the worldly. So what I found is that in the kind of Christian invocation of the secularists in the medieval tradition up until Luther, the dominant paradigm is one in which the secular is kind of at a is diminuted throughout the Christian tradition, and one is always kind of arguing against it. So this obviously plays into, for example, the idea of religious and secular clergy, that one is of the world and obviously inferior, and the clergy who are attached to the monastery, literally behind the walls, are at an elevated position. They're the ones contemplating, God and reality. Whereas such a distinction, such a kind of theological presupposition is very much not present in much of the Islamic tradition. And even when it appears somewhat in the Sufi tradition, I think it's something quite distinct from the Islamic tradition. Right. So the point here that I make is that when we talk about the Deen Dunya binary, it is essentially, it takes on a very different trajectory than the Christian secular. And it is informed by a very different kind of theological understanding of the world, because whenever one concocts the idea of the secular, it is implicated in a theology. It is an invention of religion, I argue, in my dissertation, and this builds on some of the work of ancient Christian historians.
That's very interesting.
Marcus.
Just to ask you on that particular point, yes. Is that something that comes up a bit later in the dissertation? Because I haven't come across that particular, or at least consciously, I've perhaps missed that particular point, that you're saying that the notion of the secular is actually developed in conjunction necessarily with a conception of the religious. Yes,
I do believe that's the case, and I try to begin that argument in the first chapter.
Okay.
But I do elaborate it throughout.
Sure.
Yes, essentially from the very beginning, the secular is entangled in the very idea of religion itself. Right. And for example, to give the kind of Christian context here, and this is building on the work of Robert Marcus, who has worked on Augustine and written quite a few books on him. And he wrote a kind of a much more kind of straightforwardly theological work called Christianity and the Secular. It was a set of lectures he gave. He and other scholars have revealed how in the, on the verge of the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and even early on when Christianity emerged in the, this broadly pagan Roman world, an important question came to the fore, which is how this new nascent religious community is supposed to understand the pagan world around it. What activities, for example, the festivals that the as someone who is a kind of citizen of the Roman Empire engages in, what is permissible for a Christian to engage in and what's not, and generally how one is to navigate this pagan world. And this takes on this only takes on an increasingly theological lens as the Christianization of the Roman Empire takes place under Constantine and later,
Right.
where again the question is asked: what should remain of the Roman, the pagan, and what is required to kind of be distinctively Christian? And what emerges here is a kind of elaborate discussion assumed by the clerics. And that's the interesting thing, is that the secular first kind of manifests itself amongst the clergy. And the same
Right. Right.
applies to the Islamic context. It's the ulama who are doing these fascinating, or engaging these fascinating discussions about the
Right.
dunyawi. It's not
Right.
really the falasifa as much. It's these people who are grappling with these similar questions. For the ulama, it's a question of, well, what do we do with this Hellenic heritage? Right now, we have assumed, logic to be of value. We've assumed the natural sciences to be something that is an important endeavor, not only with that carries social benefits, but also something then by which we can come to know God. But the lines now have to be drawn, right? And this is what the
Right.
kind of clergy are known to do historically. It's to kind of draw these boundaries and kind of answer these questions of, what is permitted and what's not. So
Hmm.
to me, the kind of pre-modern history of the secular is one very much entangled in this fundamental question of how religion is supposed to relate to the world. But what
Right.
that implies in turn is that you have this sort of reification of religion. You have this idea that, okay, religion is this and religion is this, and there's this space outside of religion in which one can roam free,
Hmm.
whether scientifically or whether culturally. But it's a kind of it's a very fraught discussion, and
Right.
and people take different positions on it. But that is essentially the kind of broad intervention I'm trying to make and build on the work of earlier scholars. Is actually we need to you know make kind of extend the starting point of this story, that it's not simply one which emerges ex nihilo in the 17th
Right.
century, but and I think that actually builds on the kind of recent work on the secular, that it's
Right.
something which is deeply theological, and that's why I believe there can be an Islamic conception of the secular. Yeah.
Right. Right. Jazakumullah khair. I mean, that's really a great sort of and relatively detailed overview of your project across both your dissertation. I think that you focused particularly on the dissertation, but also the Deen Dunya binary, and also the fact that, in a sense, to come up with the concept of the secular, you need to come up with a concept of religion as well. And it's fascinating, actually, that the long article in Studia Islamica is a very extensive history. It goes into, you start really in the sort of Zoroastrian tradition, as it
Yeah.
were, and I found that sometimes I really sort of enjoy the way in which you extend into traditions that are well beyond sort of the purview of Islamic studies traditionally understood.
Yeah.
Appropriately, we're in Islamicate authors, not
Yeah.
Islamic authors, so to speak. And
Yeah.
the other thing I'd say is that you display a good deal of philological breadth, which is very important actually in these sorts of temporally, diachronically, sort of very long durée kind of readings, you could argue. And at the same time, I really enjoyed the fact that you're engaging with theory to a certain extent. You're thinking about sort of of course, you're engaging people like Asad and Mahmoud to a certain extent, and to a certain extent, it's pushing back against them. But also, whether it's drawing on sort of conceptual historians, intellectual historians, and Wittgenstein pops up here and there. He's kind of a bit difficult to avoid.
Yeah.
And I think that's also an important contribution in the sense that we need to have this. Another excellent example of this, of course, is Junaid Qadri's recent work. This
Yeah.
sort of recognition that there's actually a great deal of benefit to be had from combining the philological and the theoretically sophisticated. And I think the dissertation, but also your two articles, do put this on display quite. Remarkably well. Jazakumullah khairan. I had a series of my own questions, but I'm also delighted to see so many sort of interested comments popping up at this stage, and I'm grateful to all the people putting in their comments, and we will address in one case, Toha Salim, who is a mutual friend of ours, and a
Yeah.
fellow Bengali in my case, you kind of addressed his comment as well. Just, he's giving salam to us both. Wa alayka wa alayhi salam. And he's saying, I would appreciate clarification on why did you use secular instead of worldly. And I think you've addressed that. We can potentially come back to that. But
Yeah.
inshallah, if you'd like to make a comment on that, feel free. But otherwise, we can come to those inshallah in a sense after I've had my sort of chance to interrogate you on some of these questions as well, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So, I liked the point that you made about the Assadian sort of pushback against conceptions of the secular or deconstruction of a sort against conceptions of the secular, and both him and Sawa Mahmoud and Hussein al-Ikraman and a number of people who are drawing on that sort of tradition, you in a very ironic sense are pointing out actually there's a Eurocentrism embedded within it. And I this is something which I also have had a certain discomfort about the denial of the category of religion, which of course I think your article on that has that's going to be an intervention that a lot of people have to listen to when they're thinking about these sorts of things. And before I came across your article, I had been in touch with Ahmed Shamsi, who's producing a short translation of sections of Al-Qaeda fil Mahabba, which is actually a text that you're studying as well in your dissertation. You do an excellent job with it. But to show that actually, he, as far as I recall, he sent me a sort of an unpublished version of that article, but he was saying that this is a pre-modern conception of religion. It's a fairly sophisticated conception of deen, and it doesn't even presuppose belief in God. I mean, this is what's really fascinating about Ibn Taymiyyah as well.
Yeah.
Like almost in a Durkheimian spirit, talking about religion as a social social glue that allows for a society to flourish in light of certain shared norms and values and so on.
Yeah.
But I wanted to sort of perhaps extend that question to a certain extent with respect to actually you've brought this comparative lens to this study. And actually I'm sort of like mixing up a couple of questions here, but perhaps we can begin by addressing this sort of comparativist question, which is that when we engage in that comparative, you have the I don't remember what the legal terms are, but you have a comparator, and you engage in a comparison with a comparator, so to speak. But sometimes in the process of doing that, you're taking something as the norm against which you're comparing something, and in a sense, you're trying to subvert that, the normalization of a Eurocentric conception of this. And I just wonder, I imagine you've sort of, I don't remember reading him in the bibliography, but you may have come across the work of Sanjay Subramaniam, who is, one of these great global historians, so to speak, or connected histories is what and he's somewhat critical of certain tendencies to sort of fight against, to engage in like this provincializing Europe subaltern approach. In part, he's saying that there's an inescapability. I'm not, I've not read his argument very thoroughly across multiple works. This is his article, I think, from the 90s on connected histories. And he seems to suggest that you can't get out of Eurocentrism by sheer force of will, right? You have to actually put in the work, and, I'm adding to his sort of articulation of this, subvert it through that intellectual endeavor that creates this large canvas across which you're engaging in your conversation that helps to provincialize Europe in practice rather than sort of, take it as a slogan. And I think you are, in effect, working in that sort of a tradition, but I wonder to what extent you feel that you've succeeded. And, perhaps we can sort of explore that even further, so to speak.
Yeah.
Is it possible at this stage in our intellectual endeavors to be able to escape the fact that you're sitting in Harvard or Yale at this point in time? I'm sitting in Oxford and was in Princeton before this. And in order to be respected as scholars, we are embedded within that milieu, right?
Yeah. I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. For me, I think, this was the one of the things I was struggling with throughout the writing of the dissertation and the article as well. By the end of it, I do think I've, in comparing the kind of works that I've read, from 2 decades ago or something, I think there's a new space for this move towards, epistemic plurality in practice. And it's I think we're kind of riding a new wave, and I'm trying to be a part of that as well,
Sure.
which it goes back to your point of the combination of the philological and the theoretical, right? And I guess to put it very crudely, I guess historically, I'm not sure if it totally maps on, but what we had initially is a kind of Orientalist engagement with the other, whether that other is the Indian Buddhist other, or it's the Muslim other, sorry, the Hindu other, or the Buddhist other, or the Muslim other. You had this Orientalist tradition, which was coming directly from this position of European universality and imposing on these traditions their own categories, but doing the kind of very brilliant philological work that, trying to understand what these texts meant, and I think relatively successfully understanding them. And I think limitations came from the lack of an interrogation of one's own positionality. And that is either because they were kind of before this kind of postmodern deconstructionist turn, or they kind of simply chosen to ignore it because of the sort of apprehension towards theory that's so endemic to the Orientalist tradition.
Right.
And I think we know well, we've studied with, many of these leading philologists, and
Right.
they kind of write off these theoretical sort of interventions. But what we saw then in the past couple of decades is a move towards the post-colonial, and rightly so, because it overturns that supposed neutrality by which we address these texts. Now, what I began to felt and I began to feel, and I think it came perhaps because of a generational gap, that I, emerged someone who was, many years after Orientalism, and many years after Assad. Though I was at the kind of tail end of reading these works, I I began to read these works, and I was very motivated as a kind of post-colonial subject in some ways, right? I was inspired by these works because of their dislodging of the Western Universal, but I began to feel this discomfort because of what I felt to be a sort of overcorrection, and overcorrection towards this Orientalist tradition, and like you mentioned, it became something which was, I think, still subsumed within the Eurocentrism of the academy. And so now we've kind of overcome like the philology of the Orientalist, but the theory which guides us in our analysis of not only um, the Islamic past, but our analysis of what is ritual, what is the body, and what is sexuality. These pertinent questions in the academy, they are all in many ways they're guided by theorists from the 20th century, in a very small corner of the European academy, and that to me is uh, only it's obviously not as I guess in some ways it's just as it lacks the reflexivity of in the same way as the Orientalist tradition did, and what it assumes is that.
Perhaps it has the
Yeah.
virtue of trying to subvert it, but not succeeding. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that's something that's right, that's so endemic to the modern, and it's inescapability, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was recently reading this great work on secularism by Julia Stevens on secularism in India, and she talks about how secularism has this kind of inescapable quality, and it's funny because here she draws on Foucault's idea of governmentality, but it works quite well to kind of
Yeah.
see how it works in a diffuse way, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of we fall in prey to that, and what I've noticed now, and why I feel I've in some ways succeeded. We'll see how it'll go from here on, inshallah. But um, you know, I was very, very unsure about my project at the very beginning.
Right.
I essentially formulated these ideas upon the publication of Shah Wahab Ahmed's "What Is Islam," and
Mm.
Shahab's work is very much, I think, in this post-colonial vein. And again, it's a generational thing in some ways.
Right.
He is of the generation of Edward Said and Orientalism, and he, of course, is polemicizing heavily against, Eurocentrism and basically building on the work of Assad and others.
Right.
And I felt in many ways I was diverging from the kind of presuppositions which are informing his reading of the Islamic past, and I was a bit concerned about that. I remember early on when I first wrote this article, Michael Cook had mentioned it at a lecture at Harvard. And when he mentioned that this grad student's working on this idea of the dunya of the second, he essentially, I think he said something to the effect of, we have one graduate student who was with us at Princeton who is courageous enough to translate the dunya as a secular. And to me, that comment was, I think, relevant because it was a pushback I felt from very early on that one is simply kind of ignoring this postmodern turn against the Eurocentric. But to me, what I found, and it's been very heartening so far, is that people have, in some ways, have been waiting for this sort of work to be done, and many people have been thinking it, right? And like you said, a lot of people have said, well, Deen is something in some ways kind of like religion, and in some ways it functions as a sociological category in the Durkheimian sense, and so on and so forth. And Muhammad Fadl has hinted towards the kind of secular workings in Islamic law, and so I feel that there is a kind of a shift within the academy, and it's coming at the same time that more Muslims have been, flooding in droves in the academy and have been doing work at the, these elite institutions. And to me, it's obviously, we're limited by our resources. So to produce some of the best work, to have access to some of the best resources, which, the kind of, I drew on so many different sources. It was only possible because I was working at a library like Widener and at Firestone, and having the, philological mentorship of people like, Michael Cook and Khalid Royhab. It's simply a fact of the matter that these scholars and these resources are at specific places. But what I found is that there's an encouragement of this kind of work amongst Muslims, and I think I'm feeling very confident about the success of this endeavor in sort of helping us move forward in creating a kind of constructive Muslim discourse around this.
Inshallah. I mean, I'm just sort of curious to sort of go back to that point you made about Michael Cook saying that someone's being courageous enough to translate dunyawi as sort of secular. How did you understand that? What do you think he meant by it, and how did you understand that? And I'm curious to sort of, this kind of goes back to Toha's earlier question, which is, why make that choice to translate a term which we're all very familiar with, dunyawi? We use it perhaps in our colloquial sort of like language as well. And I think, Toha's basically trying to signal as well that the term is very loaded in the sort of Eurocentric context of our discourse. Are you trying to very self-consciously subvert that? Is that something which Michael Cook is sort of like, pointing out, or is he actually suggesting perhaps, which is a potential reading of what he's saying, that here we have a Muslim who's trying to justify secularism using the language of the Islamic tradition, right? I mean, that's another potential reading of that situation,
that's a potential reading, and I think it's not the right one, and I'll explain why. But I think it's good that you make that note, because that's precisely one of the fears I had, right? In engaging this project. Am I going to be seen as a kind of someone who's just trying to reform Islam and make it secular? And what's funny is anyone who knows me knows that that's not my interest, and that's not my own kind of theological persuasion, so to speak, and even how I think about the world politically. But that's a kind of natural fear. Now, the thing with Michael, I think, is it's something which encouraged me, as someone who's a, very kind of lucid and straight, kind of straightforward historian. Exactly. Very straight arrow. He is someone who believes, obviously he has a suspicion towards theory. So he doesn't like this idea that the modern West has just kind of concocted these categories. And that's something very peculiar to Michael that I noticed, someone who's so widely read in, Hindu traditions and back to like in the ancient, he's written this brief history of the human race.
History of the human race.
What I found is he's, in all of my writings and his comments, he is if you try to make a claim of novelty, he's very skeptical. And he thinks that, so someone will say, oh, this writer in the 17th century is kind of approaching politics in a new way, and he'll say, well, no, this was there in ancient Hindu writers, this was there in the Roman Republic, and
Right.
so on and so forth. So I think it came from this sense that, well, he doesn't think that all of these, classical ancient traditions were kind of naive thinkers who are just inhabiting this sacred canopies, living under the sacred canopy, so to speak. And that's one of
Right.
the things I'm really trying to dismantle, and you see that in my introduction. This
Right.
idea that the pre-modern subject inhabited this religious world everywhere they went, and
Right.
they were not
Right.
able to
Right.
kind of differentiate.
Right.
For me, I think what Michael is hinting towards is this important work that needs to be done to sort of move beyond these caricatures of the past, and to, well, say, no, we can talk in ways that um, create common ground between the modern West and the classical Islamic tradition, or other traditions. And I think, for example, I think Patricia Crona is somewhat similar here. And
Right. Right.
I've in her articles, she has these very interesting remarks where she'll say, you know, and she was the first, I think, to note the Durkheimian kind of
Right.
perspective
Right.
that
Right.
these political writers
Yeah.
adopted. But she'll note that what we need to do is to read these writers as if they're talking to us, and in many ways it's there's you know it's an Abrahamic tradition, and
Right.
they were kind of grappling with similar sorts of questions, right? The
Right.
Jerusalem and Athens question, or in my case, I wrote the Medina and Athens question,
Right. Right.
and other sorts of things. And I think that's where that's stemming from. Now,
Right.
the question of the worldly and the secular, in some ways, I am trying to subvert it, but also to kind of reappropriate the secular for
Hmm.
ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, because I think, and this is, I haven't mentioned yet because I've just been kind of railing against the Assadian paradigm, but also, modern Islamists have adopted this kind of slogan of, you know, Islam does not kind of know a distinction between religion and the worldly, or
Hmm.
religious and the secular. You find it in Qutb and Maududi, and
Hmm.
um, this idea that secularism is a kind of intrusion from the West, and one can
Right.
understand why historically
Right.
that was the perception. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but for me, there's a problem there because, and I think it's one of the um, big deficiencies in Islamism and the kind of creative elaboration of what a kind of Islamic politics would look like in the modern age, is that we have not sort of dug deep into the Islamic tradition to understand how, for example, the Sharia understood, or kind of assumed, a sort of secular realm in which, for example, economically, Muslims and non-Muslims would kind of meet one another.
Hmm.
Or, for example, understood that consensus did not apply to um, um, dunyawi matters, right? This is something, for example, just to give a quick example
Sure.
of how it's changed in the
Sure.
modern world. Um, I mentioned in the fifth, I think it's in the fifth chapter, I make this
Hmm.
argument of how in the Zaydi and the Sunni tradition, overwhelmingly, they argue that consensus did not apply in the Umur Dunya. There are
Hmm.
some minor opinions against it, like of Razi and Ghazali, but
Right.
overwhelming, this was kind of assumed to be the case. And there were
Right.
various arguments that were put forth for that. And the first kind of inversion of that opinion that I found is by Muhammad Baqit al-Muti, this famous Mufti of Egypt,
Hmm.
who basically, and I think he's, I haven't done the work of looking very deeply into it, and maybe Junaid Qadri would know more, but he argues in a very kind of, classical work, and it's a,
Right.
Sharh on Usul work.
Right.
He essentially overturns that consensus opinion and says, no, there is, the consensus always applies to Umur Dunya. The Prophet never made these kinds of distinctions in his own life. He kind of put sidelines this
Hmm.
very,
Hmm.
very famous prophetic hadith and all of these incidents which
Right.
were recurrently appearing in usul works,
Right.
and says, well, and when one looks at the context, one realizes why that's the case. He is obviously one of the main figures who's trying to um, uh, you know uh, uh, put Abdul Razik on trial, Ali Abdul
Right.
Razik, who
Right.
famously
Right.
makes
Yeah.
this Islamic
Yeah.
secularism argument,
Yeah.
and he's one of the kind of leading ulama in that movement.
And he writes a
So
refutation of him and so on. Yeah.
he writes a refutation of him, and
Hmm.
so what that tells us is that that secularism takes on its own sort of resonance in the modern period because of the rise of the West. Something which obviously wasn't present in the pre-modern age. What I'm trying to do is retrieve that older understanding. And to just quickly answer Taha's question, um, for me, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, but I, for me, the term secular in and of itself is always defined in relation to religion. Now, I argue that Muslims had a conception, a very clear category of religion, and that it was well understood. The scholars understood it. I believe lay people understood it. People
Yeah,
understood what deen meant,
yeah,
and they understood that there were adyan, for example. And
yeah,
pursuant to that, I believe that the dunyawi, as it pertains to the dini, should be understood as secular, because the secular, as it emerges first in the Christian tradition as seculum, is always understood with reference to the religious and not with the otherworldly. And that's why I'm much more comfortable with the dunyawi ukhrawi being translated as worldly and otherworldly. For me, the secular, at its very essential basis, is means that um, this conceptual realm is defined by its non-relation to religion. And in all the discussions that I elaborate throughout the dissertation, that is precisely what is at work and what these Muslim scholars are dealing with. Where is religion not epistemically relevant, for example, in logic, like Ghazali will say, or in the kind of natural sciences? Where, for example, politically, does the Sharia not kind of impose itself? Well, in the realm of siyasa, or that one has to negotiate that relationship. So
mm-hmm.
what I'm saying is it's a contested category, as
Yeah.
most categories are, and as a secular definitively is. But I don't want to lose that important element, which is its differentiation from religion. It is defined in kind of mutual contradistinction with religion. They kind of define one another throughout, and
So
that's why I maintain that
let
view.
me sort of, in a sense, perhaps present some pushback, and let's see how this conversation goes. Because this is, of course, my doctoral dissertation was on Islamism, even though sort of the book I'm publishing right now is on a completely different topic. But some of what you've said there, I think, is certainly sort of legible within an Islamic sort of paradigm that you've really done a great deal to excavate from the classical tradition, and it's nothing which a lot of what you've brought out is quite familiar, right? I mean, it's ignored in the secondary literature, but it's familiar to those of us who've spent time reading that, and it's really important that you've gone there, done this very close reading, teased out all of these fine details that
Mm-hmm.
subvert our assumptions. But in the modern context, the term secular is a loaded term, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
deeply ideological. And I think that's the discomfort that someone like Toha is probably exemplifying here. And it's a discomfort that I actually found, occasionally reading through sections of the text, partly because of our context and because of the inescapability of the hegemonic sort of norms of Euro-America in the present. Um, you know, we have a job in a sense to try and subvert that norm, before it can be used in a sense without sort of potentially signaling that ideological consequence of the. Let me just add to that point. With respect to Islamists, and you're talking about Bakhit al-Muti'i, who is seen as like this traditionalist sort of opponent of people like Rida.
Yeah.
I think in those moments, it's precisely the historical moment which you've highlighted in the text, incidentally, and you're saying, he's concerned about Ali Abdul Razik. I found a little sort of like, unusual the reference to Ali Abdul Razik you make in the footnote, saying that this is one of the major sort of like instances, or I think you describe it potentially as a cogent argument for the secular, and I've read that argument going back quite a few years. I've looked at Muhammad Imara's work. I've looked at obviously Rashid Rida, people like Bakhit al-Muti'i. It's dealt with by Andrew March in his recent work, and so the way in which it's true that people like Qutb might not be, or Maududi might not be terribly representative of what the classical tradition might say on some of these questions, but I think they're representing a certain type of argument in a certain historical moment, which is better articulated probably by people like Tahir ibn Ashur,
Yeah.
people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi to a certain extent. Yusuf al-Qaradawi is a fascinating figure. I mean, he's less nuanced in my estimation on some of these debates than someone like Muhammad Imara, rahmatullahi alayhi. Muhammad Imara, for example, he's, when he says that the distinction between, deen wa siyasa, right? He's saying that إسلام لا يعني يفرق بين الدين والسياسة، لكن يعني يعترف بتمييز بينهما. It
Yeah, I agree.
recognizes a distinction between those two categories,
Yes,
right?
yes,
But what's crucial here, and I think this is point possibly Amar also signaled this in sort of his comments on your piece. Amar and Shasi, incidentally, for
yeah,
those who are viewing, Amar and Shasi will be coming back to Islamic book reviews for 4 sessions in a couple of weeks' time, inshallah. But the category of siyasa, it's true that in practice, very often there's this kind of distinction that emerges. In practice, it's kind of the ira lapidus argument in a sense that in practice there's a secularism that takes place.
yeah,
But, at the same time, there is this imperative which is even upheld by someone like Ghazali in al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad. There's this pressing urge to constantly make the political realm symbolically religious as well, which
yeah,
is something which the contemporary secular wants to reject. And that's something which Ali Abdul Razik actually, mounts a vicious attack on the grounds of a Euro-American conception. Well, at his time, a European conception of, what the political realm should be. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on sort of, in a sense, your critique of what I've just said, inshallah.
yeah. And I don't think necessarily it's a critique. I think
Yeah.
your quotation from Imara is something I would absolutely agree with. This
Right.
emphasis on tamyiz is precisely what I'm trying to bring to the fore in my exploration of these Islamic texts, because for me, and this I think this is in the fifth chapter on politics, is when I kind of go into these discussions of siyasa, and I think half of the chapter is devoted to these siyasa sharia discussions from Mawardi until
Right.
Ibn Taymiyyah, and precisely what I'm seeing is that what's fascinating about these works is that, well, on the one hand, in the Islamic political tradition, you have the kind of mirror for princes and these sorts of works, which essentially are kind of secular works, which are interested in, the realpolitik and also objectifying religion and how to use
Mm.
religion to the benefit of the ruler.
Right.
But you have this very interesting tradition which grapples with this tension, so to speak. And what is at the heart of, I think, much of this tradition from Mawardi and Juwayni and even Turtushi and others is this sort of distinction. So, for example, Turtushi, Abu Bakr Turtushi, this
Mm.
Andalusian originally, but Egyptian author, he's writing under the Fatimids with the Sunni viziers, and he, makes this distinction between a kind of Nabawi justice, prophetic justice, but and then on the other hand, an istislahi or islahi
Mm.
justice.
Mm.
And that kind of maps onto what siyasa does and what sharia
Right.
does.
Right.
And what interests me in what he's doing there, and Juwayni similarly distinguishes between the affairs which are related to religion, for the duties of the imam which are related to religion, and those related to dunya,
Right.
because they're very aware of what these kind of different phenomena require, and the different kind of kind of social standards by which one can kind of succeed in these two realms.
Right.
And what the point, and like you say, the point is to keep religion kind of symbolically relevant, but it's not simply a kind of symbolism. It's to also make it a more morally relevant to
Right.
the people, to create a kind of moral hegemony within society, because that is one of the ways by which society is properly governed, right? I mean,
Right.
it's not. I mean, this is something back to Aristotle's reflection on politics. It's
Right.
not simply that one can impose laws through a constitution. There's a
Mm.
deeper kind of
Commitment.
more commitment that must be there.
Yeah.
And so that's where I would definitely, and I from the very beginning, distinguish from secularism, right? The
Right.
ism
Right.
of
Right.
secular.
Right.
And to go back to Abdul Razik, I'll have to look back in my exact words, but what I
Sure.
think about Abdul Razik is, I don't buy his argument. What I think is he made a fairly sophisticated argument. And reading it several times, I
Mm.
think he's a very clear-minded thinker. Now, I
Interesting.
think he does a disservice to, his reading of scripture, for example, is not, I think, a compelling one. I think that his argument is weak, historically, for example. But I think it's a very kind of interesting text, and I think many modern Muslims have kind of neglected to engage it closely and carefully and also sympathetically because of the broader context in which it emerged
Yeah.
and sort of his, the kind of figure he is. And
Hmm.
I think it's a disservice. And it's not to say
Okay.
that his proposal is sound, and I don't think it is. And I think in many ways it is influenced by the kind of tides of Western secularism,
Hmm.
as were many modernist figures. But as with many kind of modern thinkers, I think there's a lot there to work with. And for example, just one thing that I note about him, he's very careful in kind of saying the exact argument he's making and the exact
Hmm.
limitations of his argument. In some ways, he's
Hmm.
very Weberian. He knows what he can and cannot do, and he's
Right.
sort of kind of exudes a certain humility. And I think that's lost on many people who kind of just shrug their shoulders at this kind of argument being made. So
Hmm.
what I found is that I think his argument is more carefully constructed than someone like Abdullah Naim and other later figures who I don't find as convincing. But what I'm trying to do is very distinctive, and it's not something that I want to kind of lump in with that kind of
Agenda, as it were.
movement agenda,
Hmm.
because it's
Yeah.
not, I think, something that's you know compelling, and I don't think it does service to kind of
Yeah.
holding on to the importance of how religion is always tied to the secular, and it
Right. Right.
kind of reiterates these naive secular slogans of just
Right.
separating church and state, which
Hmm. Hmm.
so many modern liberal authors have even kind of undermined, and this kind of movement of challenging liberalism as a theology or as a theodicy.
Right.
So I don't want to kind of fall into that camp either, right?
Right. No, I mean, and in fairness, it's kind of just mentioned in passing in a footnote. So, you know,
Yeah, yeah,
you're not building your entire argument or anything like that on it.
yeah,
But I think that sort of that impulse, and I've just hopefully it should be coming out in at least a couple of months' time, maybe, or at most a couple of months' time. Written an article on the notion of Hakimiyya, so drawing a kind of genealogy from Maududi to Qaradawi to a certain extent, but
yeah,
also using that in a sort of in a you could say decolonial vein, and I have an issue with some of these efforts at decoloniality or postcoloniality in the way that we've already alluded to, in that it's so dependent on Western traditions, ironically, right? So you're decolonizing, but you're drawing on the Wittgensteins and the Heideggers of the world and trying to sort of
yeah,
construct something which has no sort of like genealogical link with your own tradition. I personally, for me, what would be interesting in any of these studies, to be honest, and it's now becoming possible to do this. As you say, like we're in a kind of isthmus. We're somewhere in
yeah,
between the possibility of me going to Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah and using them as a lens to study sort of concepts like secularism, right? I mean, that's
yeah,
what I want, sort of like a Near Eastern studies, or in my own my department's literally called Oriental Studies, right? We're going to change it, don't worry. We're changing it soon.
yeah,
But it's like 50 years later, we still called Oriental Studies.
yeah,
What we're hoping to do, what I hope we can do, is we can start to draw on the richness of, the epistemic, the epistemological, the metaphysical richness of those traditions, of our own traditions, in my case, to try and analyze what's going on here in the modern,
yeah,
right? That's what's
yeah,
really interesting to me, and to engage in that conceptual history that you've done so well, but from the lens, in the way that you described of MacIntyre, taking an Aristotelian lens because he's mastered that Aristotelian tradition, and then
right,
applying it to intellectual history. What happens when
yeah,
you do that with Ibn Taymiyyah or Al-Ghazali, right?
yeah,
Or
exactly,
Al-Razi, or any one of these great figures, great sort of
yeah,
minds of history, Ibn Sina for that matter.
yeah,
And yeah, so just, I mean, as a tangent, I've done this paper on Hakimiyya. I guess I'm happy to share it with you, but unfortunately, I can't really change anything at this point because it's going to print soon.
yeah,
But
yeah,
one of the things that I just find interesting is, what does Al-Mawardi describe the 10 duties of the Imam as being? One of them is, قمع البدعة, right? Suppressing sort of deviance in
yeah,
the realms of ideology, you could argue, ideology and religion and these sorts of areas.
yeah,
And I personally think that that's something which all societies have to engage in, right? I mean,
yeah,
we're part of institutions whose job it is to maintain at the higher echelons of the intellectual sphere the correct ideology of what it means to be Western, right?
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and I mean, for better or for worse, and I think it's unfortunate for the imperial history of a lot of these institutions, particularly my own, that it's unfortunate for them from their perspective that someone like myself is coming to subvert that tradition to a certain
Yeah,
extent, right?
it is. Yeah.
I mean, let's see how long I last, right? But at the end of the day, that wave is coming, and it's
Yeah.
unstoppable at this point, just due to demographics, so to speak. And
Yeah.
it makes for a very interesting moment in the history of Western supremacy, where that supremacy is still maintained, to be fair. And even
Yeah.
in my estimation, just to go off on a bit of a tangent, in my estimation, that tradition looks like it will remain dominant for a while, because even as China reemerges, or India, India's maybe not a perfect example of this, but China is, a communist country ostensibly, that is informed by, where does communism come from, right? I mean, those are Western
Yeah,
traditions
exactly.
as well, ironically
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
And I think that what your work does so well is give us a perspective on our own tradition's richness in a way that could potentially give us the resources to develop that vision for what does a post-Eurocentric world look like conceptually,
Mhm.
as
Yeah.
a first step to actually sort of making it a reality, so to speak.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, I thank you for that. I think, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying because, I mean, part of the impetus for doing this kind of work is that, as I mentioned and you mentioned earlier, secularism is so entangled within a Christian tradition. And yet there are, I believe, many kind of sort of saving graces of, modern forms of governance. There are obviously very, you know, a kind of there. So, for example, secularism lacks one of the main kind of weaknesses of secularism. It lacks this sort of transparency, which I think pre-modern imperial regimes would have had, which
hmm,
is, for example, that, like you were saying, heresy is always a category, a political
hmm,
category, and
hmm,
it is still a category for modern secular regimes. And there's been
right,
really good work, for example, that has shown how the secularist category of bad religion, which is very prominent in legal secularism, how to decide what is and is not religious is a question that all secular regimes have to ask themselves.
hmm,
And
hmm,
across Europe, and even in some cases in the United States, especially with Mormonism and other sorts of
hmm,
religions, um, there's the question of what bad religion entails. And the sort of genealogical work that has been done essentially shows that the category of non-religion, or something which doesn't count as religion, can be traced back to the oldest category of idolatry within the Christian tradition, which essentially emerged in a polemic with
right,
Judaism. That
right.
Judaism kind of represented bad religion, of its kind of overemphasis on ritual, and obedience and things like that. And in
Fascinating.
many ways, the Muslim tradition kind of carrying on these sorts of um, um, this sort of mythos of what it represents as a kind of deviant religion. And there's no surprise there that the kind of deviant, the heresy of secularism is, of course, Islam, right?
Hmm,
And previously it was in some ways Judaism, and now it's become
right,
Islam, and it's the
right,
Muslim
right,
question in Europe.
right.
And it's not simply at a legal level, right? It's also, and it kind of goes back to Foucault, but, it's not simply from the state, it's a kind of cultural hegemony, right?
Hmm,
That
hmm,
religion itself is kind of pushed out of the norm of what is the humanistic and what is the
right,
universal, right?
right.
That that is attached to kind of illiberal, kind of inhumane ways of being and ways of
Right,
knowing, right? I
right,
mean, think about how Christian understandings of science and are kind of castigated, and Muslim understandings of politics are bemoaned in throughout these discourses,
right,
and they replicate themselves through media and through film and literature,
right,
or simply they're not allowed to legitimately um, kind of legitimately grow on their own terms in a
right.
kind of normative way, right? They're
Right.
always kind of thrown into the to the fringe corners of
Hmm, hmm,
society,
hmm,
and I think that is the position we're in right now. And
hmm.
what I wanted to do then is to kind of, because one of the things that I guess this is just a personal thing, right? This is my own
Sure,
kind of persuasion, and it's one that's developed in, I guess, the past 5 or 6 years. I've
sure.
kind of moved away from this obsession with the critique of modernity. I take it very well, and I've obviously elaborated to you right now on the
Right.
problems of secular modernity.
Right.
But in our obsession with it as kind of post-colonial subjects, we are, naturally kind of subsumed within it, and we are kind of
Mm.
we also don't realize in the many ways in which we have become modern, right? And
Mm.
the ways in which we existentially become modern, of
Mm.
how we
Mm.
relate to the other, right? How we relate to um, politics and being kind of active in that political realm, and the virtues of democracy. Um,
Mm.
and that isn't to say, we can criticize the genealogy of these things. We can criticize the function of them currently and the operation of them today.
Right.
But we also have to come to terms with who we are and how we've come to view our place in the world. And
Mm.
what I found, and this is, I think, why I wrote a particular kind of dissertation, and didn't write a dissertation just kind of looking at secularism in, colonial India or in Egypt or something like that, is I find it much more liberating to kind of just dive into, as you say, dive into our own tradition, to recognize and kind of engage with the theories, right? That the theories of these authors, that they're not simply objects of inquiry, but that they are
Right.
theorizers of
Right.
how one negotiates politics and religion. And
Right.
what I would argue, in a much more transparent way than the modern secular. So, for example, I'll
Mm.
give one example from a chapter you didn't read towards the end, in the sixth chapter. So,
Right.
in one of the issues that I probe is how the question of whether Islamic law applies to non-Muslims. And this is
Mm.
this pre-modern question, which many jurists ask. As
Yeah.
an imperial legal system, how does
Right.
one adjudicate the affairs of other religions who
Right.
don't concede to our theological presuppositions, have their own forms of rituals and marriage contracts?
Right.
So the dominant position across the schools is that these communities are allowed to regulate themselves, and
Yeah.
some of the things they'll say is that that they do not believe in what we believe in, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
as early as a Shafi, you say, when it comes to marriage and these things
Mm.
and rituals, the Jewish community, the Christian community are allowed to regulate themselves. And that's
Mhm.
the historical reality.
Yeah.
And we find this in the legal text. They'll say, when Muslims entered Persia, they allowed the Zoroastrians to kind of marry in their own ways.
Yes. Very often
And what
problematic ways from very
Very
problematic
problematic
ways from
ways.
a Shari perspective, but you leave them to their own devices. They're their own
Yeah,
communities. Yeah.
exactly. These kind of very famous incestuous marriages. And if one reflects on marriage and the kind of contestations around marriage today, it becomes,
Yeah.
very
It's fascinating.
remarkable, right?
Yeah.
But
Sherman Jackson's, of course, written about this, right?
yes,
Yeah.
he's written about this. And what's
Yeah.
very fascinating is then, well, what they had to do after that, of course, is, well, one historical fact that's remarkable then is that, well, despite this kind of theoretical allowance for them to regulate themselves, they still come to the Sharia courts in
Right.
droves. And this
Right.
carries on into the 19th century in some cases.
Right. Right.
And many scholars have written on this, many historians have written on this.
Mm.
So one explains, why is that the case? Well, my reading of this, and it sort of builds on Babur Johansson's work on Hanafi law, is
Mm.
that the Sharia kind of we can use the term secularized, but in a qualified sense, it became a kind of imperial legal system. So what happened, and you find this in and you know this as well in the usul works, and in also the works of positive law as well,
Right.
in which they'll say that as it pertains to matters of property, of mal, of economic matters,
Yeah.
the Muslim and the non-Muslim are to be treated equally,
Yeah.
and that is a stark admission to make in light of the fact that one assumes that in religious terms, Muslims and non-Muslims are not equal, right? In
Mhm.
terms of this sort of kind of religious superiority that an Islamic state
Right.
would assume, they've
Right.
conceded that when it comes to this and when it comes to that, they are to be treated as they are, just kind of as human beings, so to speak.
Right. Right.
And what that does is that creates a space in which they can address their these disputes which will naturally emerge, and that they can.
Right.
And what Babri Hansen argues is that that they can act as full economic actors, as within an Islamic society, in which they historically did, owning property and engaging in trade, with recourse to a system that is very efficient, which would be the court system
Right.
sponsored by the political regime, and
Right.
not their very um, kind of deficient communal systems, which wouldn't be able
Because
to
they're
kind
not
of,
imperially powerful, so
yeah,
inevitably they're going to
exactly,
have weak institutions. Yeah,
exactly, and
kind of the Muslim
also
condition in the West, right?
in the Muslim nation, yes, and remarkably, and this is
Yeah.
one point I try to bring to light in comparison with secular colonial governance.
Right.
This question of the rise of personal law, for example, it's obviously a very contested issue in
Yeah.
specifically in modern Indian historiography.
Hmm.
In my
Interesting.
view,
Okay.
that turned towards the idea that imperial regime kind of emerges and the minority religious communities develop or move towards a personal law through the rise of a specific legal system, a hegemonic legal system.
Hmm.
It's not all too novel, right? I don't
Hmm.
think it's
Hmm.
simply a
Yeah.
colonial invention.
Yeah.
So, Christian Sonner, your colleague at Oxford, has this recent article about how the Zoroastrian tradition, post the Islamic conquest, they essentially, after over the course of 1 to 2 centuries, their legal textbooks only focus on matters of worship and ritual law, and essentially have nothing to do with economic matters, things of commercial law that one would assume would be adopted by the Sharia courts. And that, of course, has to do, and this is something which both the Muslim jurists are themselves saying. They're in their text, they're saying that when it comes to matters of marriage and matters of inheritance and ritual law, we leave those to these communities to adjudicate to themselves, but everything else is left to us. And that's, you know to be frank, when I read these historiographies of the colonial era, very similar things are being said.
Hmm.
And what you find is that Muslims are kind of sidelined, and they're allowed to kind of negotiate their own religious personal laws,
Right.
and that there are, and if you look at their fatwa, it's more and more, it's dealing more and more with these kind of personal matters and family
Right.
law.
Right.
And and what these colonial historians will say is that this is something radically new in the history of imperialism, and it's really not. It's the same thing which happened to Jews under Roman rule, especially with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and something which I think naturally Muslims had picked up on. But what I would say then
Hmm.
is that and this is kind of what I'm trying to do in the dissertation, is that this sort of history will help us understand better what is sort of redeemable about modern governance, and what is and sort of natural, and what
Hmm.
is kind of very deviant in modern governance. And one of the things that I think that comes to the fore in the literature on the shift towards personal law in India is that there is a broader juxtaposition of secularism against Islam, where the governance itself is juxtaposed in the legal decisions, and it's trying to kind of sideline Islam, as it's obviously implicated in certain kind of discourses around race, around a certain kind of overcoming of religion in and of itself. Obviously, a very clear hostility towards religion, but also the idea that Islam represents a specific type of deviant religiosity, which kind of Christianity is here to overcome.
Right.
So it's not, and more crucially, the tension that emerges in colonial governance is that they theoretically allow them to govern themselves, but yet they continuously intervene in a way that doesn't allow them to do so in a kind of systematic way.
Right. Right.
And I think that when it comes to pre-modern Islamic rule, you don't fall into these sorts of problems. That is to say, you have these secularizing strategies, sort of conceptual distinctions in which the entire society can engage within a public realm of negotiating their affairs, commercial and otherwise, and yet they're allowed to determine their own religious frameworks,
Hmm.
which can diverge radically with the normative way of thinking about religion,
Right.
whether
Right.
that be incestuous marriages or whether that be certain types of ritualistic practices within Jewish communities. And what's distinctive about secularism in the modern kind of form is that it it lacks that transparency.
Hmm.
It says that it's not Christian. It says it's here to kind of overcome religion as such,
Right.
and in doing so, it tries to create it tries to implement a thorough regulation of
Right.
religion as such without saying it's doing it.
Right.
And that lack of transparency leads to many problems. And I think it allows this kind of, and what we've seen in recent years, this boiling up of tensions of, the Muslim minority in Europe and the turn towards the kind of right wing and this move back towards a kind of Christian universality. All of these problems come from a lot of this lack of transparency that secularism itself is a religion, and that it presupposes certain theological conceptions, which it then tries to impose without saying it's doing so, in the
Right.
name of a kind of neutrality. And I think that's, you've alluded to this earlier, and what I'm trying to do is, again, to redeem certain.
Hello. Sorry, I seem to have lost you. Can you hear me? Roshan, I seem to have lost you. Can you hear me? Roshan? Hello? I just want to let people know. Can you? I assume people can still hear me, inshallah, but it seems Roshan has sort of disconnected slightly, and inshallah, hopefully he will be able to rejoin in just a moment. I'm just going to make sure that he is still with us, but it looks like yes, he's been disconnected. Khair, inshallah. Please bear with me. Just for the viewers, I want to reassure you we will take on your questions. Roshan has been very kind to actually sort of offer to go on for quite a while. So hopefully he'll be able to reconnect with us in just a moment. And in the process of doing that, we'll be able to actually turn to your questions. I understand that we've been not really addressing those properly for the last hour or hour and a half, actually. But hopefully, we will now be able to, specifically look at those things, and that will mean that we'll be able to sort of give you your due as well. I'm just going to check that he's able to rejoin, inshallah. Hopefully, he's not had a complete sort of breakdown of his internet. His his phone has received my message, so inshallah. So please bear with me for a moment while we try and reconnect Rushain. Inshallah. I will be back in just a moment, inshallah. Okay, he is back. Okay, fantastic. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. My internet connection just went out, so I'm on my phone.
I do apologize. Would it be possible to put your phone in sort of landscape mode by any chance?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Is that
That's
better?
wonderful. Yeah, that's perfect. I was just, I assumed that was probably an internet issue. If it's easier to put it in portrait, that's not going to do any problems. But alhamdulillah that you've been able to rejoin. I was just telling viewers that we will be addressing their questions in just a moment.
Sure.
So they've been very patient with us. We've been having lots of, I think, fascinating discussions. And just before we turn to that, I just wanted to sort of comment on some of the things that you were saying earlier, which is, in this ironic sense, secularism as opposed to the secular. So you make this sort of distinction in the way you're talking about these things, obviously. So secularism kind of becomes its own.
Can you hold on one
please,
second? I'm going to switch to the computer since it'll be easier, and I think it's working.
No problem at all. Yeah, no problem at all. Inshallah. Welcome back. Yeah.
Thanks. Let me just make sure my AirPods are connected here. See if I can.
Sorry.
I'm just. Is the sound okay without the AirPods, or does it come off?
There will be an echo.
Okay, let me just.
So I've actually gotten rid of the echo now, so I've put it on echo cancellation. But the only problem with that is when you talk And if I'm talking at the same time, I will speak over you, so it will cancel out your voice probably. If that becomes a problem and you're able to re-engage the earpods, please feel free to do that. Otherwise, I think we can continue. Do you want to just say something just so that we can hear you clearly? See if it works.
Yes. I'm connected now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. So if you're connected to your earpods, I'm gonna get rid of the echo cancellation, and then we'll be able to speak simultaneously. We won't sort of cut each other out, inshallah.
That's good. Yeah.
Fantastic. Jazakumullah khairan. Apologies to our viewers for the slight disruption, but it's only been about 3 minutes. So I'm going to, just comment on some of the things that you've said so far, or just give some reflections, and then inshallah we can hopefully, if you want to add anything to that, please feel free. But I would like to be able to turn to the viewers' questions. They've been very kind and patient with us. I had said that we'd talk for about half an hour, and we ended up talking for an hour. So obviously, we're both very, very interested in this topic, and you've written hundreds of pages on it. To be honest, how long was your dissertation? I think it was like 600 pages.
600 pages, yes. Yeah.
And that's not including so far as I've read, the Deen Dunya distinction article is a separate article altogether, and the 100 pages that you've submitted to this Studia Islamica sort of thing is also not something I've read in the dissertation. So you've written it at great length, and I think you've done us all a great service. Jazakumullah khairan.
Yeah.
I just thought that, you're saying some of these changes aren't necessarily novel, right? But what is novel is these haven't been novel in Islamic history when the Muslims have been on top, right? What's novel is now that Muslims are not on top. Now, even there, I would add that it's not altogether novel. Our condition in the sort of, non-Muslim majority world has been around for centuries. Nora Berend has her excellent work, At the Gates of Christendom, that looks at Muslims in Hungary living with minorities of Jewish populations, with minorities of other religions, and how they work out their sort of communal affairs. And they basically engage in this kind of, they live in a secular world, or at least a world that is conducted by other people. And they are able to adapt. It's been several years since I read that, around 7 years ago, I think. And, what's striking there is that, there is a certain degree of attenuation of one's ability to practice the full range of the religious practice. But I can't remember where that scholar was coming from, but a scholar who's visiting there from the Muslim heartlands is commenting on how, they're trying their best under the circumstances. And I think that's perfectly reasonable. Whereas in the Muslim majority lands, and this is kind of, Noah Feldman's comment in The Fall and Rise of the Islamic State, you have this problem with the Salajiqa and these people basically usurping the domain of the polity, right? Siyasa becomes secularized, as you put it. But it doesn't in the modern sense, because as, Noah Feldman points out, describing Mawardi's sort of like intervention as a brilliant maneuver in that book, Mawardi, through, in a sense, a sleight of hand, which was criticized ironically by an earlier generation of scholars, he basically says, well, let's normalize the caliphate, as a subordinate to the sultan in real terms by legitimating the sultan through the caliph, right? I mean, this ironic situation where this disempowered caliph is saying, I appoint you to be the sultan, right? I mean, he's got no choice in the matter. Yeah. But by doing that, the rule of law is back in the hands of the ulama. The ulama control the public sphere in the sense of, they probably, occupy much of the tiny states, whatever sort of these are minuscule states by modern standards, of course. The bureaucracy would be probably occupied a good deal of it by the ulama. Certainly, the judiciary is basically all ulama. The educational class, classes and the people who are training the people who maintain the ideology of the society are ulama, right?
Yeah.
And that's a radically different proposition to the acceptance of a secular normal in the modern period in Muslim majority countries, where Muslims ostensibly have power, but of course work in this global system, which is, some people would call it kind of global American empire. Others would say at least the hegemonic norms of Euro-America, defining the global order. That's a radical radical disjuncture in my estimation. And that's something
Yeah.
which, requires a fundamental rethink. I agree.
Yes.
There's no question about that. Anyway, that's my sort of like spiel, my sort of going on that sort of. I want to give the opportunity to our audience members to put some questions to you, inshallah. And I'm going to go in order, and people can feel free to add more questions to this. Inshallah, depending on your availability, Rushain, I don't want to sort of completely take your entire morning, as it would be in North America. But should we start with Toha's? He was early to the early bird catches the worm, as it were. He was early to the party. He asked a second question, which was, unlike Sherman Jackson, so this is, contrasting your usage of the term secular. So unlike Sherman Jackson, you didn't qualify secular as Islamic. So Sherman Jackson, of course, has this fascinating article, The Islamic Secular. What was the reason behind that? I'd love to hear, inshallah.
Yeah, I think so. In general, my findings very much overlap with Jackson's much more constructive and legal project of kind of rehabilitating an Islamic secular. The reason I chose not to call it the Islamic secular, for one reason, I mean, it's I suppose a kind of prudent one, is he was there first and he labeled it the Islamic secular, and I think it will designate a specific theory of how the secular should function in a kind of Islamic sense in the modern world, and I think a very interesting one which I think might disagree with slightly. Obviously, when it comes to theorization and this kind of more creative work, there will be a lot of disagreement about how to move forward. But we essentially overlap in this idea that there is a realm of life which is not kind of overwhelmingly regulated by religion, and that there should be other spaces which should be kind of equally understood as Islamic. So there are two kind of main disagreements I have there. So the first is, again, less of a disagreement about the substance, but rather methodologically. Dr. Jackson is interested in kind of putting forth a specific theory, and I think that's all well, and I'm sure there will be much to be discussed when he comes out with his book, I think very soon. Mine is a completely historical, intellectual historical study, and that didn't simply. I mean, one part of it was just mere prudency of kind of writing in the vein of what an academic study in Islamic studies looks like today, especially as a young scholar who's just graduating now and trying to get a job. You have to write a study which is not too disruptive or too out of the fold. But it also came from an interest in kind of first discovering exactly what Muslims thought about these issues on their own terms and at length. So part of that for me is this very fundamental fact, which is that there are very diverse understandings about the secular. So naturally, one would expect Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah have very different ideas of how to negotiate the relationship with between siyasa and Sharia.
Right.
For Ibn Taymiyyah, Ghazali has this totally wrong, as you know, and even Joaini, I have this quote of a book review in his Al-Ghiyath about Mawardi. It's essentially a very devastating book review about Mawardi's ahkam, in which he says he's not really answering the question properly, and it reads as a modern book review of sorts. But I wanted to kind of bring to life the immense discussion that was happening around the secular. So for me, there isn't really an Islamic secular historically. One can obviously debate, the terms here. Obviously, if we want to use it as a very broad sense, like the idea of a secular in Islamic civilization, an Islamic secular obviously existed, and I'm arguing for that. And I use the terminology Islamic conception of the secular, but by which I mean there are certain elements which are one finds in every discussion, or certain tensions and certain questions which emerge quite often. But I believe that many different thinkers kind of approached it in diverse ways, and that also, it's what I also want to say is that there was a much broader spectrum of how one is to approach these kinds of conceptualization. So one thing I do argue is that, the ulama have a certain monopoly on defining the secular in the pre-modern Islamic world, and that's because they're the ones who are interested in, like I mentioned earlier, drawing these lines and boundaries between these realms. Now, the philosophers are much less interested in these kinds of
distinctions because they're trying to create a kind of holistic paradigm by which the cosmos are related to religion. And this goes, way back to, their commitments to the Aristotelian tradition. And also, there is, I think, another kind of tradition within the Islamic context. What I'd label the Hafizian tradition, which isn't as which approaches these categories in a very different way. I haven't elaborated in my dissertation. It might be included in the conclusion or maybe another chapter, but Cyrus Ali Zargar has written this new piece about Fariduddin Attar, and he talks about these proto-secular spaces. And I think one finds this in Attar, but also in Hafez, where you actually find a kind of secular space, a space which is defined by its problematizing of Islamic universality in some ways, by invoking figures of the Zoroastrian, invoking the figure of the Christian, and obviously the monastery where one would often go to drink, or the ruins, right? This appears in Hafez and other places. And obviously these are very popular writers being, read and recited by even, normal folk. And what it symbolizes to me is a sort of hostility towards the ulama's conception of religion and how they're thinking about how religion should kind of exert itself within society. So we see a kind of contestation between distinct social groups and distinct figures. Obviously, one being a kind of elite courtly figure and the other being one that kind of holds the reins of the law and is obviously kind of cracking down on these things. So there's sort of dialectic at play. And one of the things that I want to kind of bring attention to is that, and I think it's important as we move forward creatively in thinking about this secularity, is that many of these groups were thinking about the secular and thinking about how religion should relate to the world in diverse ways, and we should acknowledge that and recognize that. And in some ways, I would say my approach is a bit more Shahabian than the legalistic approach that someone like Dr. Jackson would take. And obviously Shahab has this kind of long polemic against the legal supremacy. Now, for me, that's obviously very relevant when we're talking about the political and about the state. But as a kind of cultural project, which I think Dr. Jackson is also interested in, I just don't think he kind of goes back to look at these sorts of resources in other places. But I want to kind of rehabilitate those kind of conceptions of secularity as well, which are less interested in kind of creating these stark binaries, which the ulama did, in the service of religion, but rather are interested in a kind of in disrupting the common understanding of religion as a critique of a clerical class which just tries to kind of impose itself on society. And what I'm saying is that much of this is there also in pre-modern Islamic civilization, realms in which people didn't really care about religion, so to speak, and I believe had something more of a kind of secular form of existence and one that's a bit hostile towards religion. So for me, this just goes back to the broader point of why I didn't want to propose an Islamic secular per se, is because there's many ways to approach this historically, and I believe if we rehabilitate all of them on their own terms, it will serve us well, especially in a kind of fragmented secular age that we live in now, right, where you have the rise of kind of secular identities in Muslim societies as well, and obviously a certain kind of commitment to pluralism, which might not have been there previously. So it's just about bringing all of these kinds of things on the table, and that's the kind of work I'm trying to do.
It's interesting. I mean, I find myself sort of sympathizing with, it's been a while since I read Jackson's article as well, but Jackson's project to a certain extent, more than the way you've described sort of what you think would be a good way of rehabilitating certain kinds of secularism, or not secularism, but certain types of the secular within Islamic history, partly because I actually think that the impulse to do that on the part of many modern Muslims is a consequence of, being part of the modern world, so to speak. And, this is kind of, you could say that, argue this is the distinction between the Catholicism of someone like Alistair MacIntyre and the Catholicism of someone like Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor, we'll talk about, the nostalgia for, a sense of fullness and meaning and all of those sorts of things, but then say, we much prefer the state we're in today than we had in the past, with a greater pluralism and a respect for human rights and blah blah blah. But I don't I don't quite agree with the rhetorical sort of like stance of someone like McIntyre, who talks about human rights as being up there with unicorns and fairies and so on. But at the same time, I think that impulse to do that, to explore Hafez or Ghalib or Attar. Attar being a bit more complicated because he's actually kind of part of the ulama community. Those ambiguities were richly explored, I think, within the Sufi realm. Hafiz, of course, is a kind of more of a secular courtly figure, but his work is instrumentalized within that Sufi realm. And I also, Shahab Ahmed's critiquing sort of legalism and this legal perspective, but fiqh isn't law, right? Fiqh is as much law as it is ethics, right? I mean, the way in which we conceive of the distinction between law and ethics is very much a product of our modern condition. The fact that law is attributed to the state is a product of the modern nation state. I think, this is an uncharitable sort of off-the-cuff comment about Shahab Ahmed's project, but, I'm as willing to discard law as I'm willing to discard ethics, right? I mean, for me, those two things are too intimately intertwined for us to think. And in this regard, I'm perhaps an unreconstructed sort of, pre-modern Muslim. Obviously, I'm not in practice, and I have to sort of think about our circumstances. But I do think that, I understand that you may not accept that sort of conception of this critique, but I think there's a richness to the way in which we conceive things in the Islamic historical tradition, whether it's through fiqh, and fiqh is a beautiful term, which, as you highlight, means this depth of understanding. And you also point out that in the early period, there wasn't much of a distinction between the theological realms and the legal realms as well when using the term fiqh. There's this holism, to go back to sort of Charles Taylor's laments about the modern condition. And I think that that's something that we can rediscover. I mean, what's really exciting about your work, in my view, and so much work in the modern period, I mean, this goes back to Richard Bulliet's comment in So Islam View from the Edge. We're in one of the most vibrant moments, intellectually speaking, of Islamic history. And what's really exciting for me is that we have these opportunities to explore these questions. But I actually don't think that we live in that pluralistic world where we can explore these questions, because that hegemonic secularism of the age that we live in creates all of these paradigms where there are certain limits to what you can speak about. And we had a brief conversation about this, like the sorts of pressures that, before this session, the sorts of pressures that I felt when writing my dissertation. Part of the reason my dissertation's in embargo is because I'm not entirely comfortable with the way I felt compelled to write it. If I'm honest. And I think that I feel very much empowered by my department and my community at the Middle East Center to really be who the hell I want to be, right? I don't have to basically shoehorn myself into this secularist paradigm, which I felt, I think anyone who reads my dissertation can see that I'm struggling against that, and I'm not comfortable with that, and I'm leaking all of my sort of like religious commitments throughout the piece, but I'm trying to hold it together so that it passes the dissertation phase. And I think that it's really unfortunate. I mean, I don't think it needed to be that way, and I'm not saying that the scholars on my committee were forcing me to do that, but there's an ethos that is so widespread, and as you put it, we're trying to get a job, right? So, you have to speak to the audience and be intelligible to them. You have to write with reference to the European tradition, in order to be able to be granted that PhD and be respected by the people who are going to hire you eventually. So, that's just my rant for this.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point, and I'll just briefly respond, because
please,
I understand this tension very well, and it's extremely difficult to disentangle our reading of the past from not only the kind of hegemonic normative discourse in which we're immersed today, but also the reaction against it. And so what I'd say first is, to put it bluntly, this kind of interest in excavating the Islamic tradition for like an affirmation of a kind of modern secular identity or a modern liberal identity, as many are wont to do, is something which is rewarded in contemporary culture. And
Absolutely.
And that's a problem, because then it will kind of dictate our reading of it, and kind of force us precisely to affirm the supremacy of a kind of secular hegemony, because its job is to essentially do that, right? To kind of
Yeah.
allow you to have that Indian rug in your household, but just as a rug, and not like an Indian philosophical way to raise one's family or something like that, right?
Right.
And so,
but it's also a mark of the success, I think, of secular hegemony. I mean, you have to give it to this tradition that it it's ideologically in the Marxian sense, right? I mean, you don't feel that it's unusual. You feel this is normal, right? This is, I mean, that's what you're compelled to feel. I because I've been sort of trained in the Alamiya tradition as well. I've always, had a sort of like infisam in my life.
Yes.
But for most people, and for plenty of Muslims in the modern period, why are you so obsessed with trying to be a pre-modern figure? Right, or a pre-modern thinker, and that's a fascinating tension of the modern period. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. But pursuant to my earlier point, is I think a part of the difficulty in disentangling oneself is that in trying to react against precisely what we're saying and falling into these traps, we also become a bit reactionary to this problem, and so we then simply see anything about the pre-modern Islamic past which does seem to disturb contemporary religious sensibilities as simply being an affirmation of the kind of modern secular. Whereas I believe the modern Islamic religious sensibility is very much modernistic in its outlook. I mean, a lot of it has been, formulated in the modern age. And I think here, maybe Thomas Bauer's Culture of Ambiguity is a bit more relevant than Shahab's work, which is that, we've kind of adopted a certain kind of essentialism about Islam, a certain kind of railing against ambiguity, which is kind of so indicative of a kind of modern outlook. And that has done a disservice to how we react to Islam, to kind of the pre-modern past. And just, just as we feel that tension here, I think many Muslims in Muslim majority societies feel that, as there's kind of Islamic regimes which kind of crack down on certain types of secular sensibilities, and then all they do is heighten that secular sensibility against the kind of religious hegemony. So there's this kind of back and forth, right? And it's just the kind of elites who are, secular, and they're very hostile towards the kind of awam who are religious. Now, what I would just say to kind of move beyond it, though, is that, and I don't mind being personal in kind of reflecting on this, is that, I'm someone who kind of grew up in this more kind of traditional framework, and this kind of modern pious revivalist sensibility. And as I've grown older and kind of come to terms with who I am, this kind of ethic of authenticity, which I think is quite legitimate in the way that Taylor and others rehabilitated. And I believe there's actually a basis in it within kind of Sufi tradition and the Islamic tradition, is that, and in my reading of history, is that at an existential level of trying to understand who one is and trying to understand one's relation to the world, and moving beyond the kind of abstract, often ideological kind of debates that we often have in our heads about who we are. And this kind of influence, all you're talking about, is very much at the heart of anyone who's trying to be, a modern Muslim. Where, what are the activities I don't engage in, what are the ones I do, and what kind of identity do I have, and who is kind of my enemy in the society. I mean, this is a debate that many modern Christians have, from Stanley Hauerwas to McIntyre and others. But for me, as someone who's a historian of Islamic societies, I think that if we read the glimpses of the kind of more popular mode of being a Muslim, there's in the pre-modern past, there's a lot of interesting existential ambiguity. And I'll just highlight two things here, two books. The first is a book you may be familiar with, translated by Patricia Crona, The Book of Strangers, which is this 11th century text of graffiti. It's a very, very interesting work. It's an anonymous author, but I think it's quite reflective of a broader ethos within pre-modern Islamic society, because it is a collection of graffiti which was written on the walls of lighthouses and mosques and ruins and churches. And one of the things that I picked up in reading this text, and it's a very interesting text to teach and also to reflect on, is, first of all, there's not much religion and piety at play in the discourse of this graffiti. And the graffiti is written sometimes by poets, sometimes by your average traveler. And it's called the Book of Strangers because the dominant theme within the writings and the graffiti is this feeling of estrangement. And just goes to show how much travel was taking place in pre-modern Islamic society. But the dominant theme is a form of kind of melancholy, of being displaced from one's home. And I actually related to it quite a bit as a kind of modern academic who's forced to move around and not really grow up around where I grew up, where many of my friends did so. But what they reflect on is these deeper kind of humanistic, kind of existential questions of what it means to feel estranged. Also, these kind of universal themes of love and, being estranged from the beloved. And none of it is mystical. None of it is religious. None of it. I think there's two maybe graffitis which have some kind of pietistic element. And what's really one fun element of the whole thing is that someone would write a few lines about himself, kind of grieving about their position in life, and they're lamenting fate. Sometimes they mention God, but sometimes it's just fate itself, which is obviously this kind of philosophical notion and pre-Islamic in some ways. And the response would be written by someone who came to the lighthouse like 4 years later, and they would say, "Oh, just rely on God." And then someone would return 10 years later and say, essentially kind of criticize this guy's kind of reliance on religion or something like that. And my point is not to say that they were all kind of religious skeptics, but it is to kind of push back against the idea that there was this kind of religious holistic worldview that everyone was kind of immersed in. There were some like Hafez who were kind of railing against the ulama, but there were also just kind of normal people who in some ways engaged with religion, in some ways didn't. And the second book that I will highlight here is a recent book by Andrew Bush, this young anthropologist, who wrote this study called Between Muslims. It's an ethnography of Iraqi Kurdish Muslims. And here, what's really interesting about his work, against Sabah Mahmoud and others who have focused on the kind of pietistic revivalist movements in Egypt and other places, he's looking at these Muslims who say they're Muslim, but not through the kind of lens of piety. They don't essentially kind of, engage in normal pietistic actions and often say sort of blasphemous things, but still kind of link themselves to the Islamic tradition in a sort of vague way. And to be sure, a lot of it is, I think, implicated in the modern Western kind of tidal wave of the rise of secular hegemony in these countries. But some of it, the kind of poet figures who he writes about, these Kurdish poet figures, very much in this broader tradition, which I think...
The Ma'arian tradition, right?
This Ma'arian tradition, which I think, if one looks at these graffiti and other things, sort of had not a dominant place, but a very natural place within this Islamic society that sustained itself, I think, quite until the modern period. And I think that's just what I want to kind of highlight, because that's the pluralism which one must account for in thinking about these issues of secularity. And it's not to, and I wouldn't elevate that to kind of sideline the importance of ethics. And that's precisely why, I think why I wrote an entire article about religion, is I believe it's important for us to maintain that we had a notion of religion, and that religion means certain things implicated in the law and implicated in ethics and theology. And it is interested in sort of drawing boundaries and these sorts of things. And that is kind of my critique of Shahab, is that I don't think even those people railing against the ulama didn't have some understanding of what religion needs to be and what the sacred is. I think those things were very much there.
Right. I mean, subhanAllah, there's just so much richness in this conversation, Jazakumullah khairan. And I want to actually sort of explore further with you some of these points that you raised, but I'm very conscious that, viewers have asked questions and we should give them that opportunity, inshallah. Shiraz Khan asks a bit of an unusual question in my estimation. Like, I guess we can take it briefly. I'm not sure. It seems a bit tangential to me. So, Salams, how do scholars classify people of the book? I don't know if this came up in the course. This was said fairly early on, but in the course of your initial presentation, I don't remember if you referred to people of the book specifically. But I don't know if you want to sort of comment briefly.
I'll just briefly say, since I touched on it and on my religion article, and I haven't had much time to talk about it. One thing that strikes me about the category of Ahl al-Kitab is that it lends itself to an understanding of religion as associated with foundational scriptures, and that this isn't simply a kind of modern Protestant invention, but one which was a classification that Muslims used. So, for example, Shahrastani essentially grades the religiosity of a religion. And here on the spectrum is, something like the philosophers, like Aristotle and maybe the Dahriya materialist.
Right.
And on the other end is a kind of straightforward religion like Islam or Judaism. Now, in the middle is something ambiguous like Zoroastrianism, where they say it's one that doesn't have a kind of authentic scripture, but does have some sort of written tradition. And by that, he judges the bookishness of a religion, and therefore how much it can be called a millah, so in the kind of strictest sense of the term. So all I'd say is that the people of the book was a very analytical category. It wasn't simply kind of a theological one, but one by which Muslim thinkers understood what is a religion and how one is supposed to govern these sorts of religions, because obviously in our tradition and in the scripture, the people of the book are given a sort of exemplary status that others aren't.
Right.
So that was a big question to ask. And that spurred on, I believe, this analytical discussion. And that's something broader. The broader point I'm trying to make is that this theology and this broader tradition often spurred on these very sophisticated discussions in theory of what is religion, what is scripture, and all these questions we ask today were asked by Muslims of bygone ages.
Right. And I mean, perhaps just to add to that, because you're talking about Shahrastani, who's a heresiographer in that particular text, but in a sense there are very significant legal implications to being, as you signaled towards the end, if you're people of the book, you can pay the jizya and you have protection within a Muslim society. You can live with a certain degree of autonomy, etc. And what's really interesting about the way in which most of the schools dealt with that category is they just expanded it to include everyone, right?
Yeah.
And that's also, really fascinating. It's in my estimation a kind of like intersection of the secular and the religious.
Yes, exactly.
In the sense that on a religious basis, you're giving them a space to do what they like.
Yes, and as it works itself out over time, it essentially becomes a governing principle by which one can include the increasing numbers of populations of increasingly diverse population into a governing system that can effectively serve them, essentially. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's something which I wanted to talk about citizenship, but I'm going to leave it to the end, inshallah, after we've addressed the other questions. So Shiraz Khan asked another question, which was, how do we make sense of someone like Ibn Arabi who explores religion through these visionary experiences? Once again, I'm not sure exactly how that, but Insan al-Kamil does figure in your sort of writing at some point.
Yes, very briefly. Just to
yeah.
clarify a point, and I think it helps me clarify one of the things I am arguing.
Yeah.
It figures briefly because these are precisely not the figures who lend themselves well to a robust conception of secularity. So
right.
I kind of make a disclaimer in some early chapters and early sections of the chapters where I'll say, there was a conception, for example, amongst the kind of school of Ibn Arabi and the broader kind of mystical understanding of the Prophet, where, Antum a'lam bi amri dunyakum, who really cares about these sorts of statements? There's ways to kind of read them away, and they do.
Right.
And later Sufi figures will do that. And for them, in my view, and that's also part of why I didn't want to talk about an Islamic secular, because I believe much of this sort of secularity I talk about, which is the kind of remit of the ulama, the jurists, and the theologians, is collapsed by more mystical figures who don't want these sorts of binaries, and who will say, well, the Prophet is actually this figure who has full purview to dictate all matters and was a kind of essentially a genius figure in all realms of life, and not simply of one who did tabligh al-risala, which is the kind of terminology the jurists who are kind of fine tuners of these sorts of texts and terms would engage in. So all I'd say is that for my project, the works of these sorts of mystical figures don't figure in quite well. And that isn't to say that their work isn't important. I think it is at a kind of cultural level, a philosophical level, existential level. But that when we're talking about the things I'm interested in, which is, governance and law, they don't lend themselves quite well to this particular issue.
Right. Jazakumullah khairan. I'm going to go to the next question, which is coming to us from Twitter. The person is called Still Reading, so I'm not sure who this is, but he or she is saying that haven't caught up on the reading yet, but any thoughts on the Hanafi binary between Deen versus Hukm in Furu'? I don't recall seeing this discussion, but as I say, I've only read half of the book.
I couldn't attest to it specifically because I'm not
Right,
exactly sure what it's referring to.
right.
Now, obviously, hukum as a category, it does feature in my final chapter on the law,
Right.
in this discussion of what exactly is a hukum,
Hmm.
and this idea of ahkam ad-diniya and things like that, and what
Right.
Qarafi has obviously a very sophisticated conception of what is defined by hukum, and that
Yeah.
in this translation Fadl did, that the hukum is that which applies specifically to the dunyawi realm, which is a very interesting
Fascinating.
qualification he makes. And
Right.
it further elaborates why that's the case, is that, and this is one of the arguments I make in the chapter,
Hmm.
that there is this very fine distinction between the otherworldly kind of theological realm and the very pragmatic and practical worldly realm. And Muhammad Fadl has written about this in some articles. And
Right.
that's, I think, something assumed by very many jurists. And that, and Ghazali's famous statement that the faqih is essentially doing a dunyawi enterprise, right?
Hmm.
And he says that he's the kind of serving as this security guard on the Hajj, right? That it's this person who's fully engaged in he's basically has a political role to play in society,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that one must not mistaken that with deen, qua deen as a religious experience. And that's really his whole polemic, and
Right.
starting from the beginning of the Ihya and the Kitab al-Ilm, where he's saying,
Hmm.
don't get confused when you go to the madrasa and you read juristic debates and theological debates thinking you're doing religion. You're
Hmm.
actually engaging in a certain dunyawi enterprise, which is either the advancement of reason and a rational debate, or the advancement of how to govern society through
Right.
law, essentially.
Right.
And his whole point is we need to essentially, he revealed that he fell into that trap at one point in his life, and now he's rediscovered that the ulum ad-din, or what he calls the ulum al-ukhrawiyya, right? These otherworldly sciences
Right.
should be distinguished from the normal kind of what I'd call these sort of quasi-secular discussions one has,
Yeah.
which is really just preoccupied with um, uh, how to smoothly function within a society, rather than how to kind of make sure one has the good graces of God in the next life. So that's
Yeah.
not precisely what you said, because I don't recall the Hanbali distinction you're mentioning, but
Right.
I'd be
Right.
interested in hearing about it down the road.
Yeah. I mean, just as you were saying that, I also sort of recall you talking about, and I can't remember if this is the article or the book, the dissertation at this point. I think it's in both to a certain extent. The notion that part of the reason that a conception of the secular as this autonomous space that can be cultivated doesn't develop in a very robust fashion in the Islamic tradition is that there is this kind of integration between the religious and the secular, which is almost seamless,
Yes.
that doesn't have its equivalent in the sort of Christian tradition, right? As you
Yes.
say, the secular, as we know it today, secularism is a kind of a product of the Christian heritage, and this is commented on by a number of scholars, and that's interesting. I mean, that integration, uh, stuck around for 1,000 years, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly where you took that, and as I say, I got halfway through, so but I'm tempted to ask you not to comment on that comment of mine because I want
Sure.
to sort of get the next question in as well, inshallah. So still
Sure.
reading has another, and feel free to sort of roll it into your response to this. So um, I've got idea of pre-moderns under canopy of religion recalls Gruel and so Zurina Gruel and Wala Khwais's analysis of new traditionalist rhetoric. So you've kind of commented on this already, actually, that in a sense
Yeah.
this notion that we're all living in the sacred canopy,
Yeah.
or historically that's how Muslims always lived, so to
Yes,
speak.
and I'll just further elucidate on that point.
Yeah, please.
I do believe, and I mentioned this in the introduction to my dissertation. So it's I would only comment that it's not the sole purview of kind of neo-traditionalist rhetoric, although it features very predominantly in how many of these kind of revivalist scholars have thought about, re-engaging the tradition in the modern age, is kind of glossing over the details and presenting a sort of beautiful kind of madhabi, Sufi hybrid within the pre-modern world, and one in which again overlooks this variety of actual experience that I outline in the Book of Strangers and in Hafez and other people. And the only thing I'll add is that this is not the sole purview of the New Traditionalists. It's also something
Absolutely.
which I mentioned primarily someone like John Milbank in the kind of neo-Orthodox, radical Orthodoxy tradition in Christianity, also builds on this kind of radical fragmentation which takes place, and it obviously juxtaposes with the pre-modern kind of holistic past. And it's one which carries on in many kind of Catholic writers. Another very prominent writer is Brad Gregory, the historian, and this very much features in his thesis about the unintended reformation, that this kind of fragmentation happens much later on. And my point is, what I would respond to that is, I think there's much to be said about modern fragmentation as a distinctively modern phenomenon and distinctive to the pre-modern past in terms of identity, in terms of society, and our relation to one another, our relation to religion, of course, and other forms of kind of social solidarity. And there's much to be gained from that perspective. And it's not unique to a religious figure. I mean, Theodore Adorno and all these people talk about this sort of development in the modern age. But there is a distinctive modernist religious revivalist rhetoric around this idea, which I do want to challenge and question, because for me, it is simply adopting the conceits of modernity, which is that we've subsumed this nice holistic primitive age of unthinking belief, essentially, and now we are kind of critical end of history enlightened thinkers who can kind of overcome that. And what I tried to show in this dissertation is, no, Muslims and even Christians, of course, and other traditions, these thinkers were very much aware of the tensions, the very practical tensions which come from a society that you're trying to impose, or you're trying to relate religion to one's life. They understand very practically of what happens in the dialectic of one's own necessities, of not simply working and laboring in a pre-modern economy, but also of just living life and in luxuries and enjoying life. They're very aware of these tensions in one's existence and in society more broadly. And so what I tried to do in this dissertation is to kind of dismantle this mythic view of the past, precisely because I think it's a secularist conceit, and it reinforces this radical rupture which takes place, which I think is not necessarily the case. Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm actually sort of less well read on as you've sort of described, like some of these other figures, Milbank and I forget the other figures that you mentioned, and I look forward to actually watching the video again, picking up some of those names. That's the great thing about these streams, that you can actually you have it recorded, so I can actually go back and sort of dig that up, and of course through reading your dissertation. But one of the things that I find interesting, you sort of comment on a figure like Qutb actually does this like in a very striking way in texts like Milestones, where he basically says, well, Muslim society or the Ummah Islamiyah hasn't existed for centuries. There was this conception that everyone was deeply sort of imbuing the values of the Sharia and Islam almost across society in this kind of almost uniform way. But that's all disappeared now. Yeah. And we've lost, we've become this all entirely secularized societies, and I think that's rightly critiqued as mythical. I mean, this is the sort of thing that everyone critiqued him on in particular. Although, this is not to say, obviously, his other work is quite fascinating and rewards sort of like attention, fi dhil al-Quran in particular. But let me ask you a counterpoint, and we have 3 other questions, but if it's okay, I'm going to sort of take this opportunity to ask you something from a slightly different perspective. And you've signaled this already, that in a sense, the Christian secular context in which we live, or the modern sort of theological, so a kind of theological context in which we actually live in a deeply religious world, like if you adopt a Durkheimian sort of like paradigm. Durkheim famously, sort of in his definition of religion, argues that he doesn't mention God in his definition of religion, and he He does mention church, but he's I can't remember exactly where he says this, but he basically says religion is something which is inherent to human societies, right? So all human societies are sort of religious, and you're very much not adopting that sort of definitional paradigm. To a certain extent, you look at sort of Ibn Taymiyyah, and arguably he also develops that sort of idea. But the sort of modern secularist conceit, or the modern liberal sort of a nation state, can be actually conceived of as deeply religious, or instilling sort of deeply religious values, if you conceive of religion in those terms. And we all recognize that people have varying degrees of commitment to that religion. So some people are like, I just want to live my life. I just want to have fun, live the hedonistic life. Some people might actually live the hedonistic life with a deeply religious sensibility that this is what I'm here to do, right? As hedonists, right?
Yeah.
And that, in the absence of, for want of a better expression, traditional religion, can become a religion unto itself. To use sort of William Kavanagh's, and I disagree with his drawing on the Assadian paradigm and negating the category of religion altogether. But he says, if we define religion as a matter of ultimate concern, the capitalist sitting, at his sort of desk and dedicating all his time to watching the stock market and doing his trades, has a sense, is theologically committed to that, and that's his God, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
in that sense, we live in a deeply religious age as well. In fact, I would argue, America is a very interesting case of this, that America is one of the most legalistic societies in the world in terms of just how integrated, also one of the most litigious societies in the world. But, law as embodied within the state, if you draw on something like Carlton Hayes and think about sort of the way in which the state becomes this fetish or the locus of, modern religion, it's quite reasonable to conceive of those sorts of contexts as deeply religious in a secular sense, right? And this is, I suspect, what you're thinking about when you use the term secularist, right?
Yes,
as a kind of like ironic religion. So
it is, exactly. Yeah. And it harkens back to this point of this kind of deliberate obfuscation of its religiosity. I mean, that's what's so distinctive about the modern in its kind of hostility towards the religious, is that it's this conceit of overcoming religion, and yet time and again we're reminded, and this, I think, the political theology tradition from Schmidt forward really brings this to the fore, is this idea that the state itself, right, has become a sort of divine figure within society.
Right.
Its regulation,
source of sovereignty. Right.
A source of sovereignty,
Yeah.
and it's the only kind of mechanism by which one can kind of go about doing things in society, kind of understanding one's own identity as well, obviously, who one is as an American or not.
Right.
And obviously with economy as well. Economy is deeply religious, and I cite this really great article, I think it's by Wendy Brown, who writes about how Marx talks about as capital is it really secular or not? Well, actually, Marx in his writings talks about the deep embeddedness of these kind of metaphysical religious claims within the idea of capital itself, and one sees that, and that's what's really valuable about this critical literature. Timothy Fitzgerald has this famous book, Discourse on Civility and Barbarity, which features in Shahab's book. And on the cover, he has this bull, the Wall Street bull, and it's become this kind of sacred object, right? I mean, it's the thing you worship, and you wait for it to kind of emerge, and you can kind of make your money, and it leads one to certain types of activities. So I think that's what's really fascinating, is that it's a kind of there's 2 points being made, I think. One is that the pre-modern age had this sort of kind of normal, and 2 critiques of the modern secularist historiography. The first being, well, the pre-modern age wasn't simply a sacred canopy that needs to be overcome. It actually has a lot of the kind of ambiguity and existential diversity which we have today. The second is that we haven't really moved beyond the kind of religiosity which was present in that age and which was dominant in that age. We just have it in a new form, and yet it still functions in the same way, albeit in a much more subtle way. And that's, I think, the danger involved in it, right? Is that, and that's one of the things I argue, right, is that there's a bit more of epistemic plurality under the Islamic legal regime, for example, or even culturally, because it gives credence to other religious communities and their ways of being and knowing, which is what is trying to be overcome in the kind of modern age in many ways, at least in a normative sense. Yeah.
Really fascinating stuff. I mean, there's just so much I'm really looking forward to when you publish. I don't know if you can publish that dissertation as a single book, but I look forward to when it comes out, inshallah. Okay, I'm gonna. So we have three final questions, and I don't want to dissuade people from asking further questions, but I suspect we will come to the limits of how much time we can spend on this, inshallah. So Asad Beg asks. First of two of his questions. Salam, what books would you recommend for someone interested in Islam and secularism? I'm currently in the process of finishing Formations of the Secular by al-Azami. So this is really squarely in your arena. Tfaddal.
Yeah, so a part of what my intervention is claiming is that there hasn't been the kind of work that I'd like done in this particular question. But if one is interested, Talal Asad's Formations is an amazing work, which genealogically interrogates the modern category of the secular in a way which totally created a kind of new field for secularism studies. But if one is asking about Islam and secularism, I don't think that's the way to go, because he doesn't really engage Islam in a kind of meaningful way, I think, although there is some interesting chapters on the modern Middle East. So it's obviously a work to engage with. I think if one's interested in the modern Islamic relationship, or the relationship between secularism and modern Islam, is this book I read of Julia Stevens, Governing Islam. And she's a historian at Rutgers who wrote about secular colonial governance. And I find it to be the most nuanced work on elaborating what secular colonial governance is, and also its relationship to the modern Muslim experience. It's an incredibly rich work of archival and history, full of engagement with fatwa and other works. So it's an impressive piece of scholarship on its own terms. But what's really important about her work is that she moves beyond the pessimism of Saba Mahmoud and Talal Asad and others, who essentially kind of leave you nowhere at the end of your books and says, well, there's no legal way by which one can maneuver and move beyond the secular. She makes a very explicit point to say, well, I've told you this whole history of how Muslims in India actually engaged the colonial legal system to create their own autonomy, to push back against certain types of secularist conceptions. And though she does argue ultimately that it still subsumes them further within the kind of secular regime, I think what's good about her book is just the fascinating way in which she recounts this deep engagement. And I think it gives a much more grounded elaboration of what the secular is and what it does in modern society, rather than this kind of abstract kind of critique of, which is, it doesn't really look on the ground of how legal secularism works. And the second figure, and he's an anthropologist that I'll note, who I think does well to critique the Assadian paradigm, is this, I think he's a Dutch anthropologist. His name is Samuel Schilke, Schielke. And he has written very interesting ethnographies of modern Egypt, where, and one thing I'll note is he's extremely lucid compared to what the common approach is to secularism, represented by the likes of Agrama and others. It's almost surprising that one can engage in theory in such a lucid way, but he helps you kind of realize that. And then you read more works of anthropology and you realize it's really just some certain figures who aren't able to kind of do that. But he reads very lucidly, such that one who's not immersed in theory can understand. And it's a very fantastic critique of the Assadian paradigm and how one should employ Islam with relationship to secularism. So one thing he says is there's too much Islam in the anthropology of Islam. And I think that's one very important point. There's this kind of fetishization which comes with the modernism. This is the point I make in my religion article, that al-Azami is a kind of precursor to this, but you have this fetishization of Islam, which Wilford Cantwell Smith famously highlighted. You look at the book titles of books in the modern age, and it's Islam and secularism, Islam and human rights, Islam and women, so on and so forth. And you compare it to pre-modern titles, where Islam rarely figures in the title. And that lends itself to this idea of this fetishization of Islam in the kind of Marxist sense, that it becomes this kind of totalizing commodity, and one thereby reifies it, and it therefore has to kind of include certain things and exclude other things. And that's sort of contrasted to what Bauer's culture of ambiguity thesis is, where you didn't have this kind of need to kind of pull everything within this one thing of what Islam is. And
Right.
I think that's also this great question which everyone asks today, right? I mean, I don't know if he explicitly critiques Shahab, but this idea of, we're obsessed with asking the question what Islam is, but is that really the right question to ask? And did Muslims ever really ask that question in the pre-modern age? I don't think they asked it in these kinds of ways. And I think it does limit the possibilities of how we think about, creatively rethink what we can do as Muslims in the modern age. So I think his works is a very important opening for at least interrogating some of the ways in which we've thought about these very fundamental questions about Islam and the modern age, Islam and modernity, of moving beyond that and doing it in a more kind of productive way.
Jazakumullah khair. I mean, really fascinating. I have a feeling that when it comes to sort of the question of how we conceptualize Islam, I mean, my gut sort of reaction is to say that Muslims didn't have to sort of talk about Islam in this reified way in the pre-modern tradition because Islam was a lived tradition that wasn't, under existential attack.
Yes.
And that's one of the fundamental transformations that take place. I mean, the question of what is Islam goes back to the Prophet, right? I mean, in the sort of Sunni canon, like Mal Islam is a question which is actually asked at like towards the close of prophecy, so to speak, as a kind of summation. And it's true, Wilfred Cantwell Smith does highlight that Islam is unusual in its self-consciousness about its own identity as a religious tradition or something along those lines. It bucks that trend in late antiquity. But I look forward to which book of Shilka are you talking about? Because I only know one book of his on.
It's a couple of articles.
Okay.
One, I think it's called On the Anthropology of Islam, and it's a direct engagement with Asad. And,
so I'm gonna have to read those. Yeah.
And the particular point is and I think you would agree with this. It's that what he's trying to say is, and I think what I value about the Islamic distinction is that one can then associate with Islam in a kind of theological religious definition. But what Shahab's work, for example, tries to do, and then a lot of this studying paradigm, is to try to use Islam to explain everything in Muslim societies, whether pre-modern or modern.
Right.
And what he shows is that that totalizing way of viewing Islam is not productive, and it actually adopts a certain kind of modernistic conceit about Islam, and a more productive way of thinking about Islam or Muslim society sociologically, or in a kind of existential way or perhaps philosophically, would not need to rely so much on the kind of term of Islam in and of itself. And that's where I think maintaining a theological definition of Islam is important, and hence why saying Deen is our own indigenous category is important, because it shows you that Islam as religion is not necessarily imposed on us by Europeans. It's actually something which we've had all along. And that's, I think, the first step that we can kind of, from there, we can kind of move forward to thinking about, well, what is its relationship to other aspects of our, daily life?
Fascinating. Jazakumullah khairan. I'm going to, we actually have just one more question, because the question from Asad Beg was repeated on 2 different platforms, just to make sure it came through. So Jahan Zebs, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, says, Salam, thank you for being brave in expressing the relation between your intellectual work, academia, and your personal inclinations. It's so refreshing and awesome. Authenticity indeed. Right. I mean, this is more of a comment.
We've talked about this a bit, though, about how much, this is the kind of big question of what it means to be a Muslim in the academy, and relating it to your work. There's this natural suspicion cast on someone who has a kind of personal religious stake in the work. You could, one of the fascinating things, you can have a political stake in your work, right? Most people do in the contemporary academy who are working, for example, in the theory of gender and sexuality, or for example in race. There's a very clear, explicit political stake, which is not rendered illegitimate. But when it comes to religious stakes, there is something a bit, a natural suspicion cast within the academy, and that's, I think something we talked about trying to push back against.
Yes, we have, and in fairness to the academy, so to speak, is particularly in the US. I think there are certain histories naturally that are associated with this kind of the shift from religious studies to study of religion. Was a major rupture in the epistemic sort of paradigms of that field, and Muslims, in a sense, are entering, in an ongoing debate at a point at which, those kind of traditional religious conceptions have been disenfranchised in a sense. But at the same time, if we'd entered at an earlier stage, we'd possibly been received with equal hostility by other religious traditions at the end of the day.
Yes.
And what's interesting for me, and what I find just baffling to a certain extent, is how I'm going to criticize my own sort of field to a certain extent here. NELC, NES, NES, Oriental Studies, these sorts of departments. Although I've been really blessed in my own department, particularly in the Middle East Centre, which is kind of Oxford's really arcane and weird. The Middle East Centre seems to be under Oriental Studies, but it's actually in St Anne's College, and it's ambiguous in that way, which we're perfectly comfortable, as you have repeatedly signaled, with the culture of ambiguity. But what's interesting about some of these departments is they really seem sometimes to be in the 19th century in terms of their positivist sort of outlook. And they think that, actually it's pretty clear that we are a secular field and we have to adopt that sort of paradigm. Now, that's been sort of taken to bits from the mid-20th century onwards.
Yes.
And so it would seem to be the case that one would be able to explore multiple epistemic paradigms and adopt various different epistemic paradigms without problem in the contemporary academy and the humanities. And as you say, you can do that in gender, you can do that in race. But I think what's important to recognize is those two come out of very distinct struggles that the Muslims have really had to contend with in the West. Muslims have been a colonized people elsewhere, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so, in a sense, that's our struggle now to legitimize ourselves.
Yeah.
We deserve to be given the time of day that, if you're a liberal philosopher or a political theorist, you can, be a John Rawls and write in those sorts of areas. And since Rawls, you can be a Judith Butler and you can be an Eddie Glaude, right?
Yeah.
But Sherman Jackson, I think, is one of these trailblazers, inshallah.
Yes.
And, we can look forward to many more. Inshallah, if we contribute, you and I and people of our generation, if we have anything to contribute, may Allah give us tawfiq. But it's going to be it's going to be a fun career for the two of us, right? I mean, and for our entire generation, it's going to be extraordinarily transformative over the course of the next 40 years or so.
Yeah,
and we can look forward to that, inshallah.
Yeah, and I'm happy to end on that optimistic note, because I think I fundamentally agree with you that we are in a very opportune moment, and we are blessed with a lot of us like to hark back to so many modern Muslims in the West as well will hark back to this kind of golden age. Maybe we can kind of or aligning themselves with the rehabilitation of a kind of Christendom or something. And one would ask, well, what is the place for it in a kind of Islamic conceptualization there, right?
Yeah.
A meaningful one that might actually lend itself to, saying something about society in a critical mode, and also about, helping us understand who we are and our communities. And I too agree that, I've had a good experience at my time at Harvard, and I've, going forward, what I found, already from my colleagues at Stanford is a very different kind of department, and especially it being a religious studies department, you have, a Jewish studies, Jewish intellectual historian who's an ordained rabbi, and you have people who are kind of allowed to be from within their own tradition and speak in kind of both worlds.
Right.
Although there's a kind of certain kind of methodological academic presupposition when one is like working within the academy, and I think that's all well, because we want to keep it a space in which a lot of different people can say different things, and that we're not kind of creating or trying to produce a certain orthodoxy. And I think
Right.
that's precisely what will allow us to kind of move forward, right? And
Inshallah.
so I think there's a lot for us to do, and it is very exciting times, and
Inshallah.
we're blessed with that, alhamdulillah.
Jazakumullah khair. Rushain, this has really been a wonderful 2.5 hours that we've spent
Thank
exploring sort of, I think, a tour de force of an intellectual project, to be honest. And I'm really, I was telling a colleague of mine that I'm reading this dissertation and I'm like, Rushain is, I suspect you're a few years younger than me, but you've written something which is so brilliant, and I'm full of admiration for it. So may Allah grant you tawfiq to bring that to the fore and get it published, and really help take the conversation forward as you've clearly started doing very seriously, inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me. It's been a pleasure to discuss with you, and it's going to help me in reformulating my own ideas and also in just getting things out there and engaging with the audience. So it's been great. Thank you.
Jazakumullah khair. All right. With that, I look forward to seeing our viewers in a week's time. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.